Good afternoon. I'm Rhonda Sims, Associate Commissioner in the Office of Assessment and Accountability. I should also say potentially good morning to those that are joining us from the West Coast or at a different time zone. But we appreciate your taking an opportunity, whether you're in the meeting and part of the conversation or whether you might be streaming this or watching it live. I do want to share with you a little update from the department. We're happy that there has now been a commissioner selected candidate identified for the Kentucky Department of Education. Dr. Robbie Fletcher currently serves as superintendent in Lawrence County Schools. He is familiar to many of the folks on this call. He has worked in numerous accountability activities over the years. He is pending, he is identified by the Kentucky Board of Education. His official position is pending approval with the Kentucky Senate as part of our Kentucky General Assembly. So that is a new process for Kentucky. This is the first commissioner to go through Senate confirmation. The Senate is in session until April 15th. Pending the approval of the Senate, we expect Dr. Fletcher to join the department, begin leading this work in July 1 of this year. So we wanted to share that. We will forward to our members of KTAC the public announcement and release that gives more information about Dr. Fletcher for those of you to have a little bit of background. And I'm sure once he is on board at KDE, I'm sure he'd be more than willing to join us on a future KTAC information activity together. We look forward to some good discussion today. We have a number of presenters from our partners, vendor partners, as well as a number of staff are involved here at OAA. And as we get started today, I am going to turn this over to Kevin O'Hare. Kevin does a lot of the behind the scenes work with Brian to get us up and running for KTAC meetings. Kevin serves as the academic program manager in the Office of Assessment and Accountability. But thank you all for being with us today. Kevin, I'll turn it over to you to do some reminders for us.
Well, thanks, Rhonda. I appreciate that. And welcome, everyone, to today's Kentucky Technical Advisory Council meeting. We do appreciate the opportunity to be here with you today. Before we start, I want to give a little background on the development of this advisory committee as we do each time we're able to come together. Kentucky Revised Statute 158-6455 was amended in 2021, requiring Kentucky to form its own technical advisory committee. And we are very appreciative of the expertise and the experience of the 5 members of Kentucky's TAC. And you're going to get a chance to meet all of them shortly. With us today on Teams are colleagues of ours with the Office of Assessment and Accountability to support the meeting. We have other collaborative partners in the Office of Legal Services, in the committee office, as well as other very, very important members of Team KDE online with us today. We're also, as Rhonda noted, joined by vendor partners that are critical in the Kentucky's work and advancement in the world of assessment and accountability. You're going to meet several of those individuals throughout today as we look at the different topics for our meeting. Before I hand the meeting over to our facilitator, Brian Gong with the Center for Assessment, to introduce the KTAC members and review the agenda, I want to remind us of some key expectations for conducting virtual meetings. The meeting must comply with the requirements of the Open Meetings Act. Accordingly, KTAC members must ensure their video is streaming. It can be seen throughout the duration of the meeting. Committee, you're asked to please mute your microphone when not talking. All discussions must be broadcast to the public. Therefore, please make sure your microphone is not on mute when you speak. Every time you speak during the meeting, please unmute your mic, state your name, and take a short pause. That'll give the camera time to recognize you. Please silence or turn off other electronic devices that may cause disruption to your sound feed. So minutes will be taken and shared with the general public on the KDE website once they become available. In addition, KRS 158-6455 requires that the department submit reports regarding the advice and recommendations of the committee to the Office of Educational Accountability by July 1st and December 1st of each year. So that just kind of takes us into the background for the meeting, and so now I'm going to turn things over to Brian Gong for KTAC introductions and review of today's agenda. Again, a huge thank you to everyone for joining us today. We appreciate you being here. So, Brian, this is where I'm going to hand things off to you now.
Thank you, Kevin. I'm Brian Gong with the Center for Assessment, and I'm pleased that the Center for Assessment has a contract to provide technical assistance to the Kentucky Department of Education around assessment and accountability, including organizing and facilitating the Technical Advisory Committee. I'd like to invite the members of the KTAC to briefly introduce yourselves, and I'll do it in the order that I have on my screen. Pete Goldschmidt, if you could go first, and then Elena, Suzanne, Corinne, and then Phoebe.
Good morning. I'm Pete Goldschmidt. I'm faculty at California State University Northridge in the School of Education, and I'm a member of the TAC. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Elena Diaz-Balello. I'm with the Center for Assessment, Design, Research, and Evaluation at the University of Colorado Boulder and a member of the TAC. Thank you.
Good morning or afternoon, everyone. This is Suzanne Lane. I am was a professor at the University of Pittsburgh. I'm recently retired.
Hello, everyone. I'm Corinne Huggins-Manley. I'm an associate professor at the University of Florida.
Hi, this is Phoebe. I'm Phoebe Winter, and I'm an independent consultant in assessment development and research, and I'm on the TAC.
Thank you. Today, we have a focused agenda. There are really 2.5 items that we have. The first, in addition to reviewing and approving the minutes from our last meeting, the first main agenda item is an introduction in detail to the Kentucky alternate assessment. And that will be conducted by the partners who are doing it at the University of Kentucky. We'll have a break, and then we'll go into a discussion of the assessment item development plans presented primarily by Pearson. And as there are changes in the assessment, last time we talked about the move to pre-equating, but there are also changes going on. So we're going to talk briefly about the inclusion of new items while maintaining the scale that will set us up for a longer discussion of this topic in our in-person meeting that's coming up. And then we'll conclude with next steps, including our review of our future meeting dates. Are there any discussion or comments, suggestions about the agenda? Okay. The KTAC members received the draft minutes from our January meeting with the materials that were made available ahead of time. Are there any comments or suggestions to modify the minutes?
No, they look thorough to me, Brian.
Okay. If not, then if we need a motion and a second to approve.
So moved.
Phoebe? Thank you, Suzanne. All in favor to approve, please say yes.
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 Okay.
Yes.
And so I could tell that was unanimous, but any opposed will say no. All right, thank you. So, Kevin, the minutes are approved without change, and you can post the final minutes to the Kentucky website. Kentucky, as every state, is required to have assessments for every student enrolled in the accountable grades, including students who cannot participate in the regular assessment with all permissible accommodations. So these are referred to as alternate assessments. Kentucky has a long history as a pioneer in developing these assessments, and we'd like to but the program has changed over time, and you'll hear about the current program. So we'd like to turn the time over to our colleagues from the University of Kentucky to go ahead and introduce and lead us through the discussion of this topic.
I'm not sure who goes first. Jackie, do you want me to go first?
Yes, please.
Okay, thank you. And can someone advance the slides, or do I need to take control? I'm not. Oh, thank you. I'm not a.
Jackie, I can do that. Or there's a take control button at the top if you want to do it. But I'm glad to do it if you'd like.
Oh, that would be very helpful. I'm a Zoom user, not a Teams user, so I'm like,
Okay.
I appreciate that, Brian. Thank you. As Brian said, the presentation is by Jackie Norman and me, Jackie Kearns, and Karen Gettler. So that's the introduction slide. You can go to the next slide. I'm going to do the topics we're going to talk about are theory of action, the student population, the assessment itself, meaning the attainment tasks, the built-in accommodations. There's also college and career readiness assessments, system use and capabilities, and then questions. Those are our topics for today. Next slide. The first we wanted to put in was the theory of action. This was developed a few years ago when we designed the current assessment model that we use for the alternate assessment. And I apologize, that print is really small, but the connection between instructional content, assessment design, interpretation of scores and uses, and then long-term outcomes. Obviously, the long-term outcomes is that students with significant cognitive disabilities get increasingly higher academic outcomes and greater access to grade level academic content. So those are the things that ultimately that we're looking for. And that theory of action also includes what the teachers need, the training the teachers need, as well as the assessment model itself, which includes embedded accommodations and more things that Jackie will go into detail about. So that is our theory of action. We base that theory of action and our assessment on the Marion and Pellegrino validity evaluation, empirical evidence, theory and logic, consequential features across cognition, observation, and interpretation. I'm going to talk about the student population, and I've already talked about the theory of learning, and then Jackie Norman and Karen will talk about the content, the observations, and the interpretations. Next slide. So I'll go ahead and get started with the student population. This is from the 2021 administration, and Kentucky has a waiver for 1%. So you'll notice that we're a little bit over the requirements under ESSA, but we have a waiver. So the total number of participation for the 2021 AKSA was 3,725 for reading, 3,703 for math, 1,559 for science, 1,607 for social studies, 1,589 for writing. So it is quite a low incidence population. The participation percentages are 1.1% for reading, 1.1% for math, and other content areas also come in at 1.1%. Kentucky did do a waiver and did a significant amount of training during the waiver, and the 1.1 is down a little bit from I believe it used to be 1.2.
So that's the participation rate. Next slide. The learner characteristics inventory is how we look at the student population and make sure that the right kids are in the assessment. And it was developed as a part of the National Alternate Assessment Center back in 2005. That baby is now 18. I'm kidding, so you can laugh about that. He is 18 and he went to college, but we were the directors of the National Alternate Assessment Center. The learner characteristics that we look at for this population, and that project helped us define who the population should be. And we look at IDEA label, we look at their expressive language, their receptive understanding of language, English learner status, engagement, social engagement is more what that's about, health and attendance. And then there are some reading and there's a reading and a mathematics general item. And then finally, the use of augmentative alternative communication, which is dichotomous, can be a little confusing to look at, but that is students who are non-speaking who have augmentative alternative, another way to communicate. So that's what the inventory looks at. We still collect all these data. And so I think the next slide shares what some of the findings are. And it's little. So expressive communication, most of the students, the first is IDEA label. The majority of the students have intellectual disability, multiple disabilities, and autism. And then there are about 6% of other disability categories, and that can include deaf, blind, it can include behavior disabilities, not usually. The primary three are intellectual disabilities, multiple disabilities, and autism, not all of autism, not all of intellectual disability, and not all of multiple disabilities. So I just want to point that out. But those are primarily the three, and that has remained consistent since we started collecting these data. That's pretty much the way the percentages go. And I've seen the same percentages play out in other alternate assessments across the nation. In terms of expressive communication is defined as what a student is able to communicate themselves, either through a variety of modes or the use of augmentative alternative communication. And the majority of the students participating in the alternate assessment do communicate with symbolic language, meaning they use words in sentences, and they are able to communicate mostly effectively. So that's about 70.4%. We've got another about 21% who are emerging in their use of symbols. They may use one or two words. They may use, the symbolic language users may also use augmentative alternative communication, but it is more advanced. Emerging symbolic language users may use one or two words or signs, or they may use pictures to communicate, or they may have beginning AAC devices. And then we have about 8% who are pre-symbolic, meaning we're not sure how they are communicating, and we're just beginning to move them into emerging symbolic communication status. So that's about just a little 8%, just under 10%. Receptively, and this is what students appear to understand, so whether they can follow a direction, a simple direction. Most follow directions that they're given, 30%. Some requires additional cues, and if you combine those two numbers, that's the majority of the population. We do still have some kids who are about 9 or 10% who require assistance, or it's uncertain if they're understanding the request from the teacher. So that's their expressive and receptive communication status. That's important because academic content is language-based, and so we need to know what their expressive and receptive communication skills are. In terms of AAC use or augmentative alternative communication, most students don't have it, but also most students don't need it. That's a dichotomous variable. So if you are speaking and you're using oral speech, you don't need an augmentative communication device. Not everyone does, but we do have about 25% who do use augmentative alternative communication. And we also have a fair percentage that don't have augmentative alternative communication and who need it, who are non-speaking, who need it. There are approximately 9 or 10% of English who have an English language learner status, but the majority do not. Most of the students engage or respond to interactions or alert to interactions. About a very small percentage, 1% of 1%, do not alert to others. And then educational placement, most are served in special classrooms, central education, resource rooms. Very few are in inclusive classrooms or fully segregated schools. So most are in special classrooms in regular schools or resource rooms. If you have questions about what those are, I'll be happy to answer them. Health and attendance, and 2020, 21, 22, after the most have regular attendance. Because health considerations do happen with this population, that's the reason for that particular item. 7 a regular attendance for most, and some receive homebound services, and some have less regular attendance. Very few, however. So most attend school like everybody else. Next slide.
Jackie, this is Brian.
Sure.
I had a question. So you mentioned about 10% students are classified as English language learners or multi-language learners. Are you familiar with how the English language progress alternate is approaching the assessment? So the WIDA access alternate, and if so, how does it, is it compatible with the way that you're approaching it for the English speaking English population in the alternate assessment?
Great question. We don't. I have no knowledge about that. No direct knowledge. Kevin may be able to answer that. I know there is an English learner. And actually, I was kind of surprised to see that many kids in this alternate and not that one. But it may be the learner characteristics or people's interpretation of the learner characteristics. So I would have to answer that question. Somebody at KTE would have to answer that question. I'm sorry.
Evie?
Yes. What's the proportion of English learners in the general population?
That would also be a KTE question.
Okay, thanks.
And I don't know if they're going to jump in and tell you.
Well, I don't. I'll jump in here, but I'm right off the top of my head. I don't have those numbers in front of me. I can try to get those numbers to be able to share back. Obviously, as we are heavily involved, obviously, with our vendor who is our English learners through the WIDA. But I'll have to go back and get those numbers just to be able to share those out. So let me try to track those down, Phoebe and Brian, and hopefully I'll be able to share them by the end of the session today.
That's a great question because participation, we want to make sure that there's access and there's appropriate language. And we also know that from my work in communication, and augmentative alternative communication, having both languages available when you're learning those systems is really important. So that's the reason I'm just reporting what we get on the learner characteristics inventory. So I wish I knew more. definitely a place to look. Any other questions? Next slide. We also ask a couple of questions about reading and mathematics in terms of what the teacher's current assessment is. And we try to make it fairly generic. We don't ask specific questions about content standards. It's more generic. But you'll see that in terms of reading, the majority of the population, there's the fluent readers, and there's applies computational procedures on the far left. Most fall in the lower four areas. About 14% are in reading, are fluent readers, and 44% are really basic, and you can see how it goes down, very, very basic. So, but that percentage just gives you an idea about where those students are participating in reading and mathematics from the teacher's perspective, because they fill this out. And then I think that Bill Audie uses this to look at the standards, but I will, and the performance. So I'll leave that to him. Next slide.
Jackie, this is another question from Ryan. Maybe I should know. Is the LCI administered to each student each year, so that if they were changing categories, you could, but they were still in the alternate, you could see that?
It is administered every year. Whether the previous year's data is saved, I can't say.
Okay.
That's another KDE question. So, and this slide just summarizes the LCI findings that we just talked about. The symbolic language use, the reading and math skills are very basic and fall below grade-specific content standards, which is what we would expect. And most attend school regularly, although about 10% receive homebound instruction or have irregular attendance. So that's the summary of the LCI findings. Any questions about that? Next slide.
Jackie, before we go on, we noticed that these are data from 21. Is there sort of a reason for the lag between the day that you had summarized and now? Or maybe they're quite consistent over years?
They're actually quite consistent over years. The reason we don't have more recent data is we're still working out data agreements. I guess that's the answer to the question.
Okay. Pete, please.
Yeah, I'm curious, since roughly a third of the students are emerging or pre-symbolic now, is that related to the grade level that they're in? So is that tends to be younger kids, or is it more heavily weighted towards younger kids because they're still emerging in terms of learning? Or is it that that's a state that they're in irrespective of grade?
Well, unfortunately, we see that distribution across grades. And most of the time, it doesn't really have to do it. It's access to augmentative alternative communication. It's access to people who believe you can use augmentative alternative communication. And most of those cases are fairly complex, but they should have access. So we've been working on that, but but we do still have kids who come to school and leave school without it, unfortunately. But that's one of the reasons I think these data are so important, because then we're able to go out and say, you really shouldn't let them leave without it.
Suzanne?
Out of the 10% that receive homebound instruction or have irregular attendance, what percentage of them take the alternate assessment each year?
These would be kids who were in the whose LCI findings, and there must be an assessment for them. So that 10% probably did. And I say probably because it's kind of hard to track that. Well, it's not. We could check it out. I've never had that question before.
Elena?
Hi, this is Elena. I just wanted to return to the theory of action and just get a sense of the types of studies that have been done to kind of track students over time, to just get a sense of what is happening in the spaces, because there are so many claims that relate to instruction and how this in part would potentially move the needle as far as performance is concerned. And I'm just curious to understand kind of the types of studies that you've done to kind of look at the LCI findings in relationship to some of the work that you may be doing at schools to collect some of the information in terms of how teachers are using these scores in order to kind of adjust to better prepare and to better accommodate the needs of students over time. Just could you provide us with a little bit of just a sense of some of the work that has been done to kind of examine the theory of action as it relates to some of these findings?
I wish I knew more in terms of studies. Our project is not tasked with conducting those kinds of studies. So I really can't say very much. We get our data, what data we have and what data is in the technical manual from additional sources at KDE. So I can't say.
I mean, I thank you so much. I'm just wondering if this is something that we could potentially recommend as something that's really critical and important, because it's, I think the theory of action is nice, but it's really important for us to at least get a sense of how is this actually kind of changing the practices of teachers who are using this information to better meet the needs of these students. And so if it's not your group, then if it's another group that could potentially be contracted with through the department to kind of engage in these studies, I think it's a really critical thing to do.
Absolutely, I agree with you.
Elena, I'll put that into the minutes as a recommendation, and the TAC you'll have a chance to review that before the the draft minutes go to the department. You know that I think the department has some capacity, but most of their work on validity studies and impact studies are done by HUMRO, as we've had them, and there's a process for that. But I'll put Elena, I'll put the recommendation in.
Thank you, Brian. That's correct.
KTAC members, any other questions or comments?
There's more to this presentation. This is just, I think,
Yes.
the end of my part.
Right. Thank you, Jackie.
Mm-hmm.
And Brian, before we move on to the next part where Jackie Norman takes over, just to follow up a little bit on the previous question that you had, and I think Phoebe followed up with about the specific numbers. I know for this current year we're still finalizing our access testing that just wrapped up, but we tested in the neighborhood of a little over 43,000, I think, total EL students, and approximately less than 500 of those were alternate access or alternate EL. So that just kind of gives you a ballpark range and that total figuration.
Kevin, do you know what percentage of students taking the regular assessment are EL students? It's around 15%.
I want to say it's in the realm. Again, I don't have those numbers. I want to say it's probably around 10 to 15%.
Okay, Phoebe?
Yeah, the 500 out of 43,000, was it 43,000 or 4,300?
That was 43,000 was the total number of EL students that took the access test.
Yeah, that's low compared to the 1.1% in the state. And I know that identifying these kids is really difficult. But that might be an incentive to try to check on identification procedures, because if a student's EL and is also having communication issues, then it's hard to tell what's what. But if there is a language, if there is language in there, then that makes a huge difference for the child's, especially receptive communication.
And most of the time there is language.
Yeah, and the education. I mean, in terms of if it is an EL issue, as well as significant cognitive disabilities, it's really important to know so that the student can be educated well. So I know everybody around the country is trying to do identification better. It's just a very hard thing to do.
Absolutely. Yes, I would 100% agree with that. So, Jackie Kearns, are you moving forward, or is this where you're handing it off to Jackie Norman?
Let me look at the next slide.
Okay.
So this is Jackie Norman. So.
All right. Well, thank you for that. And Jackie Norman, do you have, are you comfortable taking over as presenter? Or would you like Ben to do that?
I'm able to navigate the slides, so I can do that. Thank you, Kevin.
Okay, thank you. So Brian, I think Jackie will take over there, and we appreciate Jackie Kearns being able to talk with us at the LCI. And so now we'll turn over to Jackie Norman, the other Jackie.
Good afternoon. As you've heard like 5 times, I'm Jackie Norman. I'm also at the University of Kentucky, and I'm going to do a relatively quick summary of the Kentucky alternate assessment. My colleague Karen, you see kind of halfway in the screen here, is sitting with me because we share an office, and we've yet to figure out on Teams how to navigate join the reverb in a Teams meeting. We've got it in Zoom. We can't figure it out in Teams. So we'll just be sliding the computer back and forth. But in terms of the Kentucky alternate assessment, we have 5 different components, if you will, broken into academic and post-secondary readiness. And for our academic performance, based on ESSA and the federal and state accountability requirements, we measure those to the attainment tasks. We do those, as you can see on the screen, in reading and math, grades 3 through 8 and 10. And then in science, we measure grades 4, 7, and 11. In social studies, grades 5, 8, and 11. And editing and mechanics and on-demand writing at grades 5, 8, and 11 also. So we test in the alternate assessment all the grades and subjects as the same as the general assessment. There's a little variability in high school because they do end of course testing, and we kind of are targeting those grades where they most likely would take that end of course test. So our attainment tasks are a multiple choice assessment. There are 3 possible response options. Attainment tasks are given in task sets of 5 related items. So for example, if there's a reading passage, there will be 5 questions about that passage. And there will be anywhere from 1 to 3 standards. Well, we have a few math tasks that might have 4 standards, but the standards are identified on the cover sheet of the attainment task that could possibly be assessed. And then we also test across 2 windows for the alternate assessment. It's quite a big burden at grade 5 in particular, where they have to do reading, 5 and 8, where they have to do reading, math, social studies, and writing. And they have 15 items in the fall and 15 items in the spring. So we broke it up like that so that our 5th and 8th graders weren't getting hit with 30 items across 4 content areas in the spring. It was a lot to manage. So we do test across the 2 windows.
Suzanne has a question.
Could you talk a little bit about how you use the data across the 2 windows and the way in which the assessment has been designed? If the first window in the, I think I saw in the technical manual, November or something, if that is just covering content that would most likely be instructed on during the fall, and then the winter has content that's most likely instructed later.
Yes, thank you for that question. So one of the things that we do is the scores are all, it's a cumulative score. So the scores from the fall are simply added to the scores in the spring for one end score, one total score at the end of the year. But we did bring stakeholders together from across the state and ask them to look at the prioritized standards that were selected for assessment at each grade level. And we prioritize what standards are tested in the fall based on that feedback and what standards are tested in the spring, so that earlier subject matter in the school year is tested in the fall, and the stuff they get to later in the year is tested in the spring, to try and reduce that cognitive demand on the population.
I just have a follow-up question. This is Suzanne. Have you collected any evidence that the teachers are following that somewhat instructional sequence that you've suggested? And then I just have one question about the items. I know that some alternate assessments have items that if they get it wrong, then a choice is taken away. And I was wondering if that is the case here.
So I'm going to start with the last question, Suzanne. I hope that's okay. We are a paper and pencil, quote unquote, paper and pencil based assessment. So I'll get to that in a few slides about how it's administered, but our test is a scripted test that's read aloud to the students one-on-one. And so all items are assessed of all students, and then based on the DOK and the requirements of the item, they are put into the scale score accordingly, like that. And then back to the first question, as far as I know, there has been no study to indicate whether or not all teachers follow that, because we don't prescribe a curriculum. We simply took a group of stakeholders and asked, based on the progression of the standards, when those things would be taught. Kentucky does not have and Kevin, if I'm wrong, please jump in, but I believe Kevin does not have a prescripted curriculum. They only have standards that are required.
Pete?
This is Pete. As a follow-up to that, does anyone monitor the teachers when they're administering the assessments? Because, and I'm sure this is a unique circumstance, but one could imagine that if a teacher comes across an item that he or she has not taught the topic for, that the reading of those items are cued a little bit differently. And so I would have some concern about providing some cues by the teacher.
So we have a few things in place in the state of Kentucky. One, so the answer to your question is we do not go into the districts and monitored during the assessment. I do not know if KDE has somebody that does that. We do monitoring of records. We have training in place, both through the alternate and through KDE, with the code of ethics that indicates, the policies and procedures, and their understanding that they have to go by those policies and procedures. They go through a training. They have to pass a certification test in order to administer. And then they also go through the code training that KDE does in addition to the alternate training. The other thing that they do is I've lost my train of thought. I apologize. At some point, I believe KDE was considering fidelity audits, but I know that they have not been done in quite some time. I know that Humro did some many, many years ago.
Jackie, this is Brian.
Yes.
Could you just give us a sense of what the score distribution is for students overall in the most recent year? Like how many of them are proficient or advanced? Or
I would say we are a somewhat bell curve, heavy in the middle, with most of our students scoring proficient and apprentice, and fewer at the ends of novice and distinguished. We have a small percentage, a much smaller percentage of distinguished with the new content standards. I think that's to be expected. I believe they found that also in the general assessment when the new standards were enacted. We are heavy in the middle and thinner on the ends. If that helps.
Thank you. Do you think it's about 50% proficient, or maybe 40 or lower?
We were there a few years ago before the content standards had changed. I think we're probably closer to the 30s, high 30s with proficient. I think the combination of proficient and distinguished is in the 40s, low 50s, maybe.
So,
different grades and different content. It's hard for me to answer that question when you think about it. Like grade 3 math is different than grade 3 reading is different than grade 4 science, and middle school math, the content standards are really hard. We're doing some work there, but some grades and content areas have a higher percentage of proficient and distinguished than other grades and content areas.
But I know, Pete, you have a common question. Some of this addresses the question about administrator fidelity and queuing and things like that, because the proficiency rates are not super high. Anyway, Pete, go ahead.
Oops, sorry, this is Pete again. Another question then, is there any reporting of the November administration back to teachers, parents? So kind of goes to Elena's question of what, in the theory of action and how this information is useful. Since you are assessing in the first half of the school year, one presumes that would be very informative. So is there any formal reporting of those results?
No, it's a cumulative test result. So we give a final score like the general assessment does in the spring. So it's really just to help reduce teacher and student burden.
Jackie, just so I understand, the assessment that is administered in the fall, it sounds like none of those items are re-administered in the spring. Is that correct?
That is correct. If I can get to the actual design, that might answer some of these questions.
Suzanne, before you go on, Suzanne has a question.
Jackie, feel free to hold off until later on, but I was wondering if any evidence has been gathered to see if the students would have performed better if the fall assessment was administered in the spring.
All we have, to be really honest, Suzanne, is some qualitative data that we got back from the field in 2021 when, because of COVID, we could not do a fall assessment, and it was prior to having field tests. And we sent the entire assessment out in the spring, and the teachers came back and said verbally, just anecdotally, that's all we have, that it was too difficult to get it all done. They couldn't keep the students' attention long enough to do 30 items. You know, they had a hard time getting it done within the testing window. You know, because you've got one teacher assessing all the students in her class. So up to 10 students in her class across all the different content areas and grades. And so all we have, just, you know, full transparency, is the anecdotal data from that year after COVID, where we did it all in one window and the teachers felt very overburdened.
This is Suzanne again, and I'm not sure where Brian was going about administering items, if you've ever administered the fall items in the spring, but if there's any possible way to try to administer 1 or 2 items again in the spring. I guess I'm less concerned about security and kids recognizing the items for this assessment, just to see if there's any differences in performance. Because I'm wondering the extent to which their performance is being underestimated by having some of the items in the fall. Because if some of the material is kind of cumulative over time, thinking about kids getting better at particular skills, they might perform different on them in the spring. Just a thought. Thank you so much.
That makes very good sense, Suzanne. And I'll follow up with that and say the flip side could also be true. If the material's covered in the spring and after Christmas break, the kids may no longer remember how to do it. So I think we'd have to be, I love the idea, and I think we'd have to be very measured in how we think about doing it to get a good, clear result of what it's showing us. It's a great idea. And so, Brian, back to your question. I looked ahead and I think I did not go into further detail. So I'm going to take a few minutes to say that these 5 item task sets are unique. And while some standards are assessed in both the fall and the spring, particularly in mathematics, for the most part, the standards are unique. So we only have like a handful of standards that we assess in both the fall and the spring. So for the most part, a task set will have 5 unique items, and we label those task sets A through F. So we do A, B, and C are items 1 through 15 in the fall, and D, E, and F in the spring are items 16 through 30. They're all numbered 1 through 5 within the task set, but there's 30 items that we measure each year. So I looked ahead and I did not have that information. So hopefully that answers your question.
Thank you.
Jackie, before you move forward, I don't know that it's allowed you to take control or not. Deanna was just wanting to confirm what number you were on.
Yeah, so I think there's a button here called Sync to Presenter. Do I need to hit that?
No, there's one at the top called Take Control.
Right at the toolbar at the very top should look like a computer screen with an arrow pointing.
There you go.
Thank you all.
How do I put that back, Ben?
Now you just have to navigate. There's arrows on the bottom left corner. You just navigate to the slides you want to be on, and we'll all see it.
I guess it's these.
Do you all just see the slide, or do you see the notes and everything?
We just see the slide.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. There's no notes. Not that it matters. It's just messy. Thank you. So our task development is stakeholder driven. We bring in a group of Kentucky teachers from across the state. We ensure we have general education teachers and special education teachers. There's typically also somebody with VI expertise in the groups, and the stakeholders write the items, and then they discuss them as a group, and they tweak them, and they get them ready. Once they feel comfortable with the items that they've presented as a whole from that group, they go into our template and they get illustrated. So our assessment does have illustrations, which Karen will talk about in a few minutes. And if an animation is needed, that will happen too. And again, Karen's going to discuss all of those built-in accommodations in a few moments. And then we format the assessment to make sure that it's ready to go, that it meets the style guide and all the final formatting criteria. Once we do that, we send it out for content and bias review. Again, this is all Kentucky stakeholders. For the content review, we ensure we have general education and special education teachers. For the content review, we have community members as well as teachers and parents who come in and do the review. While they review, we have our bias people look for bias concerns and our content people look for alignment concerns. What we do is we bring them back together to debrief at one time so that if people who are reviewing see a concern for potential bias, they can bring it up while the content people are present and they can maybe hash out a solution for how to fix the problem. And the same is true if there's a content concern, they can hash it out to make sure that the solution doesn't involve a potential bias. I see there's a hand.
Do we have yes, please, Corinne.
Hi, it's Corinne Huggins-Manley. Could you give just some detail or point us to where we could look at how are they trained? Like, what are they told to look for bias and for alignment?
Absolutely. And my mind's not quite what it used to be. It's a nice steel trap. Once it's in there, it doesn't come out. So we do a full training with the group individually for content and a different training for the people for bias. And they have a checklist that they go through. So for content, we're asking them to look for content alignment, we're asking them to look for, is the item measuring what they think it's measuring? Does it link back to the content standard? Do you see a variety of depth of knowledge? Is everything a tier 1 or do you see some tier 3s in there? Is everything that's needed there? Is everything that we say that they need there? Is there anything that has construct of relevance? So in other words, if you're unfamiliar with jet skiing in the Ohio River, is that going to cause a problem for answering the item? So they look for all of that stuff in content review. In bias review, we ask them to not only look for bias, but also potential issues of sensitivity. So is there anything written that could be offensive to a particular group of people or students? Is there anything that would cause one group of students to be better able to equipped to answer the question? So one example I give is we have a very diverse geographic location in Kentucky. We have a lot of really, really rural areas, but then we have Louisville, which has a metro. So, our Louisville teachers spend some time teaching kids how to use mass transit, and our rural teachers can't even get a taxi cab. So we talk about the differences across our state and how we have to think about what's available and would that cause a bias for a group of rural students to have to know something about using the metro or something about farming equipment for our kids in urban Kentucky. So there's a list of 7 questions Off the top of my head, I cannot remember all of the bias questions. I typically do the content and Karen typically does the bias. She's right here. Karen, can you think of the other bias questions?
The questions are pretty much the things that you've already mentioned. You know, is there a geographic component to an item that might advantage or disadvantage a student? Is there a prerequisite or related knowledge, cultural knowledge? Is it sensitive? Is it we also try to prevent including items that could be present barriers in terms of disability type. So we try to be careful with our language. So we ask about the language of the items, all those kind of things, basically cultural sensitivity and disability concerns.
And then the sensitivity thing, like for instance, we found, we had a severe weather task and it was getting ready to go out and we had a series of tornadoes and flooding in Kentucky. Well, you know, clearly that was problematic because that could be traumatic for students who just went through that. So they really do think about all the things that could potentially cause a trauma response when they're doing those bias reviews. Corinne, did that answer? Was that sufficient? Did you get what you needed?
Yes, thank you very much. That was very helpful.
You are welcome. This year in 23-24, we implemented a full-scale statewide field test. We are doing testing for items in both window 1 and window 2 so that they look similar across. We did field tests in every content area except for science. We were waiting for those standards to be finalized, and now that they are, we're working toward that. And what we did is we, going through those processes we just described for item development and content and bias review, we prepared an additional assessment. So we did everything, but we only gave each student one additional assessment per content. And so we divided them. So we had form 1, 2, and 3 in the fall, and we had form 4, 5, and 6 in the spring. And so if you got form 1, you got all essentially what would be task A moving forward. So you would get reading 3A and math 3A. And you got one additional set of items to complete. We did something called randomized spiraling based on our colleagues, some of the other partners in psychometrics, for delivering those assessments we did it just we randomly assigned them based on alphabet, form 1, 2, or 3 for each school. And this school gets 1, this school gets 2, this school gets 3, this school gets 1, this school gets 2. And so they're randomized and they're sent out. And what we are waiting for is some additional items. So we will look at the data to see how those how the students performed on those field test items. And we will bring in yet a third group of stakeholders to review items that have some additional statistical values that based on those statistical values, we will ask a third group of stakeholders to go ahead and look at these items and determine whether or not they think it's aligned, whether or not they think there are bias concerns. Is it student and grade appropriate? Are we measuring what we think we're measuring? And is there an issue you see and can it be fixed, or should this item be eliminated before we move it to the operational field test? Lots of questions.
Pete, and then Phoebe.
Yes, I'm not sure if I heard correctly, but did you say that you spiraled across schools, so randomly across schools, or across students?
I said schools and I actually meant districts. So we ship by district, and so what we will do is we wanted to ensure that our biggest district, like Jefferson County, got some of each form. Where it went within the district didn't really make a difference to us, because when they record the score in our system, they are able to tell us if they had form
Which
1,
form?
2, or 3. And so we can match the data to the form.
Yeah, it's not, I mean, when you have the scores, that's all fine, but in terms of reviewing the items, if you have Form 1 that's all in school, all in one district or all in one school, then the performance on that item is going to be correlated among the students within either the school or the district. And so you want to be careful in interpreting your field test results if they're not randomly assigned by student.
Yes, thank you. Because we, this was the recommendation of the psychometric group that is working with KDE, because we do not give a form we do not give each student a booklet, because the assessment is scripted and read aloud to the student. There is one book and they don't record in a booklet. This will all make more sense when Karen talks in just a minute. She's coming up next. So they record student responses on a response sheet, and it is a book of materials that they present. And so it's in a binder format, and it's in a 2-inch binder. And the students like I said, the assessment is scripted, it's read aloud to the students, and they answer the questions one-on-one. So we don't have we do not provide a booklet to every student. We provide a booklet to every school. So that is a limitation of our results that we will have to just consider when we are looking at our findings. But we did ensure that the smallest and the largest districts in our state in each geographic area received each of the forms.
Maybe, and then Suzanne.
Yeah, I have, I just want to clarify, make sure I got what you said before, because that changes my question. So each school gets one unique booklet, and school B may have a different booklet than school A, even in the same district. Is that correct?
Yes.
It is correct only in terms of the field test. The rest of the assessment is the same. That is correct.
Okay. Good. And then you said something about randomly assigned by alphabet, or did I hear wrong? Is that by the school name or?
So what we did is we have the districts listed alphabetically, and for each district we know, well, here we go. You can't see this, but I have a list of all the schools, and Adair County's first, and I see they need 1 elementary, 1 middle, and 1 high. So what we did with that is there's a secondary sheet that says, okay, Adair's the first county, they're getting Form 4 for everything. The next county is Allen County, and they need 2 elementary, 2 middle, and 1 high. So they got a Form 5, a Form 6 at elementary and middle, and then they got a Form 5 at high school. So it was just totally based on alphabet of where they fall in the alphabetical order. We assigned 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3.
Okay. Yeah, that's by student, I would have been a little concerned. I don't know about districts because I don't know how they're named, but I won't worry about it offhand.
And we did ensure, like I said, we did ensure that our large districts like Jefferson, which is Louisville, and Fayette, which is Lexington, all of our large districts they have every test form. So all of our so we will have that information from the urban areas. And then while our small districts only get 1 form, we have multiple small districts, and we ensured that each small district got different forms so that we are getting that representation from across the state and across the school type, if that makes sense. Did you have another follow-up question, Kate? Okay. So I'm going to turn it over to Karen, who is going
Can
to.
I ask one question? I'm sorry, this is Suzanne. I was just, this might be overkill, but I was wondering if it would be, since you're not spiraling at the student level, if it would be reasonable to try to get information for each item on the nature of the students who took the item and perhaps their previous year's performance on the assessment, so you have kind of an idea for each item or each form. Who are the kids? Where are they on the score scale, so that when you're evaluating the items, you can take that into consideration?
We actually would have this year's scores to compare it to, because the field test items will be pulled out and not part of their final measurement score. So we wouldn't have to go all the way back to last year to do that. We'd actually be able to see how they performed on the field test versus the other items within the assessments and compare it that way. That might be something to talk to KTE about with our psychometric friends who do that work for them.
Thank you. It's about.
I didn't change it, sorry.
You're fine. Hi, I'm Karen Gettler, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the accommodations in the assessment. Some of this will be a little bit of a review from what we've talked about already. But first, we're going to start with the ones that are actually built into the assessment itself. As Jackie said, the ATs are scripted, and they're administered one-on-one, and they're read aloud. And we use formatting. This is a printed assessment in a binder. So we use formatting to indicate to the test administrator what should be read aloud. That's in quotation marks, and it's read exactly as it's written, versus a direction to the test administrator. So we use different text formatting to indicate to them what is a direction that they should follow and what is something that they should say aloud. And anything that's in quotes has to be read aloud exactly as it's written. As Jackie also mentioned, there are sets of 5 items, and they are accompanied. The way the binder works, there's a teacher or a test administrator page and a student page, and the student can see the response options. There's 3 response options. Each response option is accompanied with a picture response and written text, and those are for the student. And then the test administrator can see those same responses on their copy. All of the assessment items themselves are included at the end of the task, and they're written on a separate sheet. And those are also for student use if the test administrator wants to present the item, because on the student page, what they're seeing is the picture response options, A, B, and C, and the text that's underneath the picture response options. So I hope that was clear. But I guess we'll have questions if it wasn't. We also have supplemental materials that are included in the task. This is, as we've discussed, a stakeholder written assessment. So when they write those items, they also include directions for supplemental materials that they believe will make the items accessible for the students. And we build those into the assessment. Some of them are built in, some of them are outside of the actual binder or that written task. So that would include things like charts, tables, graphs, maps, and photos, picture boards. Those are things that are actually included in the binder. The supplemental materials appear at the end of the task, but they're referenced in the test administrator directions. So anytime a supplemental material is needed for an item, so say the item is asking it's a math item asking about a coordinate plane, then the test administrator directions will be italicized, and the test administrator will read, present the student with supplemental material. And then that supplemental material is labeled accordingly, and the test administrator will present that to the student in conjunction with that item, just following those directions. So they do have time prior to the delivery of the assessment to make accommodations that, so high contrast color or anything that they need to do for the supplemental materials for a particular student. They have some time to do that prior to administering the assessment. So that was pretty quick, but is this it?
I don't know. I think you have to just click on it. Yeah.
Okay. So as I said, there's a variety of supplemental materials that appear in the tasks themselves. And this would include charts and tables. Those usually are just text and numbers, but sometime I can think of one right now with the little animals. Some of those are tasks and tables do have some picture supports in them. We also provide graphs, and those are in all the multiple formats you would expect, charts, pie charts, bar graphs, coordinate planes, in all the, and again, those are described to us by the item writers and developed by our illustrators, but they give us the parameters for those. We also have maps, and those are also done by the illustrators, but they're adapted for particular content or particular, so for instance, we have historical maps, we have resource maps, we have geographic maps. So we have different adapted maps. Those appear at the end of the task. And again, the test administrator will be directed when to present the map to the student. And then we'll talk a little bit more about some further adaptations for some of these things. Those maps, obviously, while they're all typically adapted from resources that are recommended to us, they are, the content within the map is reduced to present salient information and take out anything that's extraneous and could just be overwhelming or cause too much cognitive load.
Thank you.
So,
Karen, we have a question.
I see a question.
Elena.
Hi,
Yeah,
Elena.
Elena, please.
Hi, Karen. This is Elena.
Hi.
Just a question. I was just wondering, because you also run the bias reviews, I'm assuming that all of these areas are also being scrutinized under the bias reviews, correct?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, so just every single one of these supplemental materials and pictures and et cetera, et cetera. Okay, there's just a lot of stuff here, so.
There is a lot of stuff here. And so, you know, as part of the training, those items that we talked about, we do ask, you know, are the supplemental materials being provided to the student necessary to answer the item? Are they appropriate? Is there any extraneous information in the supplemental materials? So that's part of what they look at when they consider these. And sometimes in those reviews, they will say, well, you know, they'll suggest a different way. I think we could do it like this, because you're right. We don't want to give students more items, more things to look at than they really need. So the illustrations are drawn by our project illustrators, and they do follow a style guide, and there are all kinds of conditions and stipulations for the way that it's done. It's been developed over a series of years. We have a resource guide that contains some of those illustrations, and we present that. That's on KDE's website at the beginning of the year for picture response options that are content aligned and frequently used in instructions. So they can have that to refer to at the beginning of the year. But in general, when the illustrations that are not in the resource guide are drawn, they follow a set of guidelines, and they're simplified to just include salient information that's relevant to the response. Every once in a while, we do use photos. That's very, very infrequent. That relates to some of the content standards that specifically require multimedia presentation of text and content. When we do use a photo, which again is very rare, they would have high contrast color and very simple subjects. It would not be a detailed photo of a street scene or something like that. I can think of one off the top of my head, which is just a butterfly on a flower, and that's it. That's the whole photo. So we try to keep anything like that as simple as we possibly can. The illustrators also develop picture boards. The picture boards accompany text. We use these as a standard process in reading to present a narrative, and they're done with a series of thumbnails. In the text itself, there are superscript numbers that are correlated to the thumbnail illustrations in the picture boards. So there are some pretty extensive task administration guidelines provided in the training for test administrators. So they know when and what's permissible in terms of directing the student's attention. But in this case, with the picture boards, that superscript indicates to them where the narrative is in correlation with the thumbnail illustrations so that they can direct the student's attention. Every once in a while, we use picture boards in areas outside of reading. If we, for instance, in social studies had a text that we're providing that the item writers felt students would benefit from having a picture board to help them while they are reading or listening to the narrative or the text. So we don't usually do it outside of reading, but we do it occasionally if the text is complex or lengthy in any way. Let's see. So we also have animated clips. These are done by our illustrators. Also very, very simple design, follow some basic guidelines. They're developed to demonstrate processes and events. So for instance, science experiments, we have one, or tasks. We have one for surfing. We have several of those. We have both a closed caption and an uncaptioned.
For reading, that's the next slide.
Oh, that's the next one.
Science.
Oh, this is science. Okay. Scripts are provided. So we do provide scripts for all of our animations that tell the test administrator exactly what to say or how to direct the student's attention to the animation itself. Supplemental materials also include small objects. That's also very infrequent. We have a science task where we send out.
Wait a minute. Did you skip a reading slide?
No. This is the next one. Can you? Sorry, I'm navigating on Jackie's computer, which I'm not used to.
Now this is reading.
Oh.
So this one was science. So we differentiated.
Okay. Scripts provided in test. Okay. All right. Reading, animation, and audio files. I don't know. Sorry about that. I'm definitely not familiar with this computer. The reading, animation, and audio files. The narratives. So we have animations to accompany simple text narratives. So we have one about a bike ride, for instance. And here's where we have an audio recording that goes with the animation. And we also have a closed caption version and one that is not closed caption. So we provide, which the test administrator can use either one of those. It's at their discretion.
Student preference.
Yeah, just whatever the student prefers. We do have also very infrequently some audio files. Again, this relates to multimedia standards. So we have an audio file, for instance, of a radio commercial, and in the same task. So those content standards, just to be clear, would require for multimedia presentation of text. So for instance, we have one that is an audio commercial that is just a recording, and we have a script that we have written that can be provided to the student. And we also have a flyer, which is an illustration, which contains similar information. So that would be that type of, is somebody asking a question? Okay, so for both animation and audio scripts, again, files, there are scripts provided. So is it right here?
Yeah, should be. Oh, you could be.
Oops, I did it again. There we go. Okay, so I don't want to take too much time, but we also have supplemental materials that are provided outside of the task. This includes, for instance, one science task we provide a small baggie with objects in it when we're talking about physical traits. And so it has like a rubber band, a paper clip, a cotton ball, some things like that. We also have image scripts that we provide that are textual descriptions, I've alluded to those previously, of illustrations, photos, and other visual materials that are given to the test administrator so that they can read that script. We have tactile graphics, which are only provided when they are requested. They're requested through KDE, and these are for students with visual impairments. They're used to convey usually non-textual information, so coordinate planes, graphs, life cycles, or things of that nature. Some of the text on those is in Braille, some of it is raised text. These are developed with the expertise of VI consultants. Give them for graphs, maps, and other diagrams. And again, they are accompanied by what we call a TA note. I was trying to think of what the TA note was. But it is, again, a script that the test administrator will read that describes the graphic. And then they're provided with directions. I think it's back to Jackie.
So Jackie Norman back. I have a couple of quick slides. I know we're running close on time. Go ahead.
Hi, Pete.
Hello, I just had a couple of questions about the supplemental materials, and admittedly, I don't know the literature that specifically, but one question is whether or not you have done any sort of, you or the psychometric team has done any sort of analyses of whether or not the supplemental materials generate any construct relevant difficulty or easiness, because sometimes adding supplemental materials will make things more challenging for a student because it overwhelms them, but sometimes it provides some additional cues for them that makes the problem a little easier and they're no longer answering the original question. So I don't know if you've done any analysis on that.
So if you don't mind, Karen, I think that the supplemental materials are not truly supplemental. We use that language because they're not in the actual item itself. But for instance, if we're asking the slope of a line in a coordinate plane, they have to see the coordinate plane. So it's presented as a separate sheet of paper, which we call a supplemental material, but it's actually necessary to answer the question. We call the passage a supplemental material, but they can't answer a question about the passage without first reading the passage. So that's really, they are just part of the assessment. They're just provided at the end so that they're big enough for the student to be able to see it and not just tiny on the student page.
Right. They're only supplemental in the sense that that they're not part of the item. But I understand what you're saying. They
are part of the item, though. They're just not written
they're
in
part
the
of.
page.
Well, they're not on that page. They're not included in the actual item. Like,
right.
What is right? You know, what are the coordinate planes of Becky's house? Well,
I mean, that of course makes sense, but it seemed like in a couple of visual impairment aside, it seemed like in some of it sounded like you said in some of the couple of the previous slides that there could be additional information provided. So if you're listening to something, then maybe there's a flyer
Okay.
potentially.
The scripts that we refer to, that is not actually additional information. That information, so for instance, if we had a water cycle and the item asked a question about the water cycle and a student who was visually impaired could not see the water cycle, the script just describes very concisely and precisely what is in the graphic. And the same is true for an audio file, for instance. The script is only precisely what is in the audio file. No more, no less. And because the assessment is scripted, the administrator is not allowed to add anything to that.
So, and Pete, in reference to what you just asked about the flyer versus the audio recording, that standard requires the student compare this piece of writing to a multimedia version of it. So it's not in addition. They are having to compare what's on A to B. So if there's an animation, the animation is like the movie of the story. If there is an audio file, it's a commercial, and it's an audio commercial and a written commercial on a flyer. So that's required by the standard, is that they look at two separate things. So one is not supporting the other. One is they're both required of the standard, and the student has to make comparisons between the two.
Okay, no, I mean, that all makes sense. And I guess one thing is that the term supplemental materials created a lens for me to view all of this in one way versus another.
Yes.
And the key thing I was concerned about is that there's decisions being made by the administrator of the assessment that's in response to the way that the student is taking the test. And we want to try to avoid that, because obviously that's going to change the interpretation of the responses.
Right.
Thanks.
You're welcome. Phoebe?
Yeah, and Pete said it. I was just going to suggest perhaps changing your terminology, if you can, to these are really item stimuli for the most part, and there may actually be some supplemental materials that are supplemental materials, and so differentiating between the two, like some of the stuff that you might add to but isn't part of the actual item would be really helpful, I think.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And the terminology, that's well taken, because it does imply that it's in addition to, and it really isn't. It's a translation.
Anything else before we go on?
Jackie and Karen, if you could wrap up in about 10 minutes. So okay. I think you've got the post-secondary.
This will actually be fairly quick. We think. So the post-secondary readiness is the other part of our assessment, not necessarily required by ESSA, but we do this in the state of Kentucky. So we have college and career readiness measures that are checklists in format. So for college readiness, we have the transition attainment record, or what we call the TAR. The TAR includes a student interview where the transition team talks to the student about what they want to do after high school to help build standards for the student to strive toward. And these are skills that are based on the academic content standards, and they have a rating of 0, 1, or 2. So if a student is rated at a 0, it means the team has seen no demonstration of the skill. If they're given a 1, that means that the skill is developing and the student can do it with assistance or when given a prompt. And if the student is rated a 2, that means that they have independently performed the skill, or the team considers them to have mastery level at 80% or better independently. So this is a team decision. And in the TAR and in the ESAR, which we'll talk about in a minute, if the team cannot determine, if they cannot come to consensus on a score, the lowest score is given. For career readiness, we have the Employability Skills Attainment Record, or the ESAR. It is based on skills that are linked to employability and foundational academic standards for the alternate assessment, or the EFAS-AA. The three main areas that they target are personal qualities and people skills, workplace knowledge and skills, and fundamental academic skills. We have, in terms of the ESAR, we've removed most of the academic skills because we address those in the TAR. However, there are some basic ones. The rating scale is identical to that of the TAR, 0, 1, and 2. So does not demonstrate, demonstrates with assistance or when prompted, and does it independently or mastered. This is, again, a checklist that they do in grade 12. Grade 12?
Oh, the ESAR?
Yeah.
Well, they can do it in grade 11 if they've completed 2 courses.
Yeah, so they have to do a course of study to do the ESAR and that is part of our career work experience certificate, which we call the CWEC. This is a course of a program of studies that requires minimum of 4 courses, and they have to take those in sequential order. So students who have taken at least 2 classes can take the ESAR, and they can apply to take it in grade 11 if they've completed those 2 classes. The work experience certificate is simply a yes or no question. Have they completed the 4 classes? Yes or no. The Office of Career Technology certifies whether or not the student has completed that. We do not. We just have a place to record it. The other thing about the ESAR is it's about work-based experience. So they try to give them experiential learning in an actual work environment. They do allow for entrepreneurial skills in school businesses. That came into effect after COVID, and it worked well for them. So they continued that. Any questions about our post-secondary readiness? So I'm going to turn it over to Karen to talk about systems, and then we'll be done.
We're already there?
Yeah.
Oh, so we have several systems online that we have briefly mentioned. The first is our online training system. That's the initial system for teacher registration. Data from that system is transferred to what we call our student registration database. But in the online training system, we have the training and quizzes that are related to all the assessments that we've talked about, the AT, the TAR, the ESAR, and the CWEC. So there are trainings in there. When the registrant has successfully completed that training, there's a quiz, and when they successfully pass that quiz, they print a certificate or save it, and they have to provide that to their DAC. So we also have the Career Readiness Database, which Jackie mentioned, and that is where we have an ESAR entry score. Oh, and our CWEC certification, which again is just a check mark, but that's where they go in to put in their, enter the scores for the Employability Skills Attainment Record. We have a third system, our SRD, our Student Registration Database. This is where the student data is uploaded. This is where response entry for the AT, those are entered from a score sheet into this system, and the raw scores are collected, and further down the road, the scale scores are applied. It's a hierarchical arrangement of data based on district and schools, teachers, students. So it opens for 2 periods during the year, during the assessment windows, both 1 and 2 in the fall and spring. There's also a quality of school climate and safety survey that's in the student registration database that's administered once a year. And also an opportunity there to enter responses for the TAR, both to the interview and to the scored item options. And we also have, and I think Jackie mentioned this, response entry for field tests in here. There is a place, of course, where the test administrator will need to select which form they are administering, so that obviously, so we can align the responses correctly with the item form. So that was super quick. I think that's it. There are some AKSA websites where the technical manual is, where we have a lot of resources. For instance, that picture response glossary or resource guide is posted there, test administration guidelines, things like that. So those are the websites. Yeah. Oh, hi, Suzanne. I'm sorry, Suzanne, I can't hear you. I see you're speaking, but it looks like you're muted.
That's because even though I am on a lot of virtual meetings, I always forget my mic. Okay, so I'd like to go back to one thing, and then I had a general comment. I was wondering, I keep on thinking about the assessment being administered in the late fall and the spring, and I was wondering if there's a way for, as the teachers, because the teachers have to put their scores within some in the computer, right? They had,
yes.
Okay. If there's a way to ask the teachers for each kid, like before or after administration, if the student has been instructed on the particular standards, just to get a feel for the extent to which the kids have been instructed on the standards that are being assessed in the winter. And then in the spring, you could say since January or since the beginning of the year, maybe have both or not at all. And my other thing, I went to the technical report, and I really like your theory of action. And having it up front is great, but I noticed that the validity argument was at the last chapter. And because the validity argument follows very closely to the theory of action, I'd love to see that brought up front and then just referenced as the evidence is provided in each of the chapter, go back to the validity argument, and then have a summary at the end. Just a thought.
Thank you for that. As far as the question about trying to look at the alignment between instruction of the content standards and delivery of the assessment, particularly in the two windows, that is something KDE would have to respond to.
We'll include it in a TAC suggestion, and the department can decide how to respond to it.
All righty.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
That was a new topic for us. We appreciate the whirlwind tour, but a lot of detail that you provided to us. TAC folks, we're a little bit behind, but I think we'll be able to fit things within all right. So let's come back at plan to start promptly at 2:30. Welcome back to the Kentucky Technical Advisory Committee meeting. We're ready to start the agenda item on assessment item development. We'll turn the time over to Pearson staff to introduce the topic and lead us through the discussion.
Thanks, Brian. Let me ask a question, if I may. I know that we're running a little bit behind the agenda. I do have some people from Pearson that are here to support, and I wondered if we are interested in having quick introductions from Pearson, or if I should just move ahead, let you know who I am, and start with the presentation.
Karen, if you could introduce yourself and members of your team quickly, I think that would be appropriate.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. So I'm Sharon Staples. I'm speaking to you from my hometown of Dublin, Georgia. And I am a senior test development manager. And what that means is that I am working with the teams that are developing the content for reading, writing, and science that will be in front of students potentially on future assessments. And I'm going to move next to Adrian. If you want to, Adrian, I'll hand it to you and then you can hand it on to the next person if that works.
Thank you, Sharon. Good afternoon, team. My name is Adrian Simmons. I am the program manager for the Kentucky Item Development Scope of Work, supporting with general oversight as needed. And I will hand it over to our ELA specialist on hand, Charlotte. If you want to come off mute and share a little bit about yourself, please do.
Good afternoon. I'm Charlotte Carey. I'm an ELA content manager, and I assist with resources for ELA development.
And I'm Jane Toussaint, and I'm a senior assessment specialist with Pearson, and I am managing the ELA development for reading and writing. And I'll pass it to Steve in science.
Folks, I'm Steve up in Maine. I'm leading the science development, and it's cold here. I got a fire going in the background.
Thank you. And we also have our psychometrician. LaCoon, would you like to say hello? You probably already know a lot of the people on the call.
Hi, everyone. This is LaCoon Ho, senior research scientist from Pearson team. I'm the psychometric lead for KSA program.
And Sharon, we also have one more guest with us, Lana Williams, if she would like to come off mute as well.
Thank
Lana?
you.
Hi, everybody. I'm just here to listen in and see the presentation. Good to see everybody today.
Thanks, Lana. And I'm going to go ahead and take control, make sure that works well before I launch into anything. And I believe that I do have control now. I'm just going to advance a slide to make sure that it changes on your side. Did everybody, I see you nodding, Brian, thank you. So I know, Brian, in talking with Kevin and KDE, that one of the things that we heard was that, you know, TAC has seen these slides and we don't need to go through word for word and looking at each slide. I wanted to put out two options. If you'd like, I can go slide by slide so that we will have the opportunity to let the TAC ask questions as we are looking at each slide. And maybe I can provide some context around the slides as we go. Or if there are some things that you want us to begin with, I would be happy to move to a specific point in the presentation. Do you have a preference?
Sharon, could you just go over this timeline and set the context for the members of the TAC, because this is sort of an unusual activity that you're doing.
Yes, absolutely. So TAC, what I want you to recognize is that we are in what you see on the slide, where we have started in December with the request from KDE to do this development and then handing off the development for August 2024, that the scope of what we are doing for reading and writing is about 600 items and about 100 passages over the reading, the on-demand writing, and the editing and mechanics. For science, the scope that we're looking at is about 600 items. It's really a little bit more than 600 items. And because many of those items are within sets, we are also looking at developing the stimuli that would support 60 sets. So we got underway in January with our planning. We started the actual development last month. KDE, the KDE academic consultants have already started doing a calibration review on, it was, Jane, you're going to have to help me out here. Was it reading, correct? On reading grade 6-10?
That is correct. Reading grade 6 through 10 was reviewed, and currently there is an on-demand writing set being reviewed by the KDE staff.
Thank you. Thank you. And Phoebe, I see your hand. Let me go ahead and.
Yeah, I have a terminology question. What is a
Yes.
calibration review?
So because this is a busy period for the academic consultants, what we are doing is we are sending a selected number of batches, and oftentimes at Pearson, we'll call those a calibration batch. So it's an initial batch where we enable feedback, and then we're able to apply that and move forward, and the team doesn't review every single item that's being developed.
Thank you.
Thank you. We have a committee meeting planned in July, a content and bias review, and this will be a virtual meeting with the Kentucky educators, and then we will be applying those edits and finalizing the items for handoff. Any other questions that I might answer? Okay, so what I'm going to do then is just walk you through. We'll be looking at each subject. Some of them may have more discussion than others. I do want to give you just kind of a big picture idea when we think about the development, it has been a while since there was development for reading and writing. The last time that development occurred was in 2020. There was some development in 2019 and 2020. Science development has been on hold for, I would say, since before that time period. So what we're doing is we're taking feedback that KDE has given, and we're applying that to the development that is occurring. The bullet points that you see here, these are applicable to both reading, to reading, writing, and to science. And then there are some specific things around science that we might talk about a little bit later. We know how important accessibility is to KDE, and so that's a high priority to make sure that the items are accessible. We also know that in recent years, KDE has asked for shorter tests, trying to reduce the amount of testing time. So the second bullet there about readability is not only just talking about the passage text itself, but also the length of the passage. What is a student is really focusing on the essentials that are needed in science, for example. In ELA, in reading, we're going to see that there are more single passage sets being developed as opposed to paired passage sets. And also thinking about the inclusive language, because we know that in spring 24, that it was a very high priority to KDE to make sure that items that were on forms would not disadvantage any student because of the language that might be used. So I'm going to move into reading and writing, and I'm going to be starting with reading. Just a very high-level overview for you. You can see the different item types that are offered. What you're going to find with reading and writing is that there is a lot of continuation in terms of the writing, the item types that are offered, the point values, blueprint is the same, standards are the same. I do want to draw your attention to the domain abbreviations, because those abbreviations are going to be used later in some of the tables that we look at. So there are 3 domains for reading. The KID is going to stand for key ideas and details. The CNS is going to stand for craft and structure. And then IKI is going to stand for integration of knowledge and ideas.
Karen, this is
Yes,
Brian. Are the domains used for sub-score reporting or just for blueprint specification?
I believe that these are also used for reporting, but I would need to defer and see if LaCoon might be able to help out with that.
Yes, the domains are for the sub-score reporting. The only exception, I believe, is engineering in science, because we don't have enough number of items to be reported.
Thank you.
Thank you.
LaCoon, just a reminder, and for everyone else, the requirements for the public meeting is that if anyone who speaks, they need to have their camera on. So if they're responding to a question, if you have your camera off, if you can make sure that you turn it on before you respond. Thank you.
Yeah.
As I said, there's a lot of continuation from the development that occurred in 2019 and 2020. So I will just call out some things that I haven't mentioned previously. The development is 100% passage-based. This is true for both reading and writing. For reading, the passages are from authentic sources. So these are published materials. And then DOK and item types are very similar. So I'd like to focus your attention on what a set looks like, because as we walk through the slides, we'll be seeing the aggregate of the development and then how that breaks down. In terms of a single item set, there are 7 multiple choice items, 2 multiple select items, 1 TE item, and then either 2 short answer or extended response items. At grade 3, KDE has traditionally had short answer rather than extended response, and so we continued that. And then at grades 4 and above, we get into 1 short answer and 1 extended response. And then you can see how the domains break out in terms of the item development. I think that what I would point out to you in terms of the integration of knowledge and ideas is that the reason that you see a lower number there is because integration of knowledge and ideas, the standards themselves, the Kentucky academic standards, have some requirements that when we think in terms of assessment, those requirements don't necessarily merge with what we know is valuable to KDE and also what the standards themselves require. And let me just give you an example. Each one of these domains, key ideas and details, craft and structure, integration of knowledge and ideas, has 3 standards per domain. When we look at the IKI, the integration of knowledge and ideas standards, there's 1 standard that is not assessed, that's not applicable to literature, and so that's going to remove the ability to do some assessment there. There are standards that require the analysis of art or the use of multimedia, and that's something that traditionally has not been emphasized. There's been less emphasis because of the desire for making sure the items are accessible. And then there are some of the standards that require having a mixed pair, and that adds again to the reading load and to the length of the test. So this table is just a very high-level summary that lets you see the total development that's occurring for reading. If we're thinking between the reading and the writing, about 57% of the development being done is for reading. And we'll move on, and there are going to be 2 slides that are comparing the blueprint with the actual bank. And of course, the bank, this is based on assumptions. This is based on what has been ordered, and assuming that all of the items will survive. We know that there might be an item lost at committee. There might be an item lost somewhere along the way. But the big picture that I think you might be wondering about, and I want to acknowledge that it would have been ideal to have an additional column that said, well, what was it like before this development? And that was something that quite honestly, I just didn't have the time to provide in advance of the meeting, but I want to give you that information now. Looking at the fact that if we think of the blueprint and where we're headed with the bank, I think you would see where the bank was and where we're headed. The bank is moving in the right direction. I'm going to give you a specific example. If we look at grade 6, the bank shows that there should be 45% literary, 55% informational. We've bumped up literary. We're now at 51%, and you might think, oh, but that's too much. We need to be at 45%. Previously, it was at 54. So we're bringing the bank in line with where the blueprint asks it to be. And I see a hand up, and I don't see a full name, but I see that the last name starts with gold, and it matches the color of the hand.
There we go. It's Pete Goldschmidt. Thank you. So this table is useful, but I think what would have added to it is getting some sense of absolute numbers, because your bank could have 50% of literary and 50% informational, but that could be 2 items. And so your distribution is great, but in actual numbers, I don't think that's where you're trying to get to. So I think another piece of information would help kind of get a sense of what you're aiming towards and what the progress is.
I hear you, Pete. I'm gonna confess also to thinking, which one would the TAC probably want to see? And I chose percentage, and I chose wrong. So I will. I'll keep that in mind for the future. Thank you for that feedback. I also want to. I think there was one. I also wanted to mention that when we're thinking about the blueprint and the requirements, I think that there are 2 other pieces of information that are important. One is that, as LaCoon mentioned earlier, there's the emphasis on the number of points for the blueprint. So this is looking at the percentage by items. It's not looking at the percentage by points. So if we did this by points, I think we would see different information, because an ER item that's worth 4 points, for example, would weigh in how the literary informational balances. In addition, I think that we also have to acknowledge that the forms in recent years, spring 23, spring 24, have had 5 sets on them. And so we're never going to hit an exact 50-50 split for the lower grades, because something is going to be 60% and something is going to be 40%.
This is Brian, and just a follow-up suggestion that's like Pete's. It'd be helpful for me if you had a table that had something like the number of administrations worth of meeting the blueprint you had in the bank. So if you have things like the blueprint has a certain number, if you're doing post equating, there's a certain number of equating items, and so you don't need new items because you know you're going to be reusing a certain number. So what I think we're interested, I'd be interested as part of the information is how robust is the bank in terms, how many years worth do you have of meeting the blueprint under normal conditions of replacement release and things like that. And as Pete said, if you had if you're doing 600 items and across grades, so you're getting maybe 70, 80 items, if you're field testing that many, maybe you get 50 items. Is the blueprint well within replenishment range, or are you going to have to keep doing that for a while in order to build up a robust bank for having having several years forms worth. That's the type of information I think that I would find useful as well as what you have here.
Yes, I think that's a good suggestion. Thank you, Brian. Any other comments on this particular slide? What this does, and you're going to see, you know, the same kinds of breakdowns as we look at all of these tables, looking at where the bank will end up, where we anticipate the bank will end up. You can see that we are within range for many of the CNS for the craft and structure. The IKI I've already addressed for you. And then again, just moving in the direction of the requirements.
And this is Brian again. Just in terms of absolute numbers, so the IKI is the farthest from the targets, it looks like. So are there enough IKIs to fulfill forms for next year, for example?
I believe so, because the requirement is a minimum of 10 points is the recent requirement. And so I believe that the minimum of 10 points is possible. I also understand that, and Brian, I don't know if this is something that is unique to subjects such as math or social studies, but I believe it would also apply to reading, and LaCoon can help out here if necessary, that KDE has a matrix approach in many instances where the forms are taken as an aggregate. And so the importance would be the IKI as a whole, but LaCoon, I think you have better expertise there than I do.
Hi, this is LaCoon. So when we talk about the 2024 operational forms, we did make sure that for each domain to be reported on a sub-score, it has to be meet the minimum number of score points 10. We do have a couple of forms that a little bit low on the integration of ideas because of the accessibility issues. For example, for the Form 1, we can put some technology enhanced items on there. So for those couple of forms on the grades, we do have a little bit lower on the integration of ideas coverage. Overall, it's still on the target for the minimum number of score points as 10.
Thank you. Phoebe, I see your hand up.
Yes, this is Phoebe Winter. I'm a little taken aback by the idea that the accessibility of the item is going to limit the domain. I do understand the need for accessibility, but I wonder, and I'm still not sure exactly why we're looking at this, why this big big surge in item development. So it might have something to do with that too. I didn't hear the background, or I didn't process it very well. But the things that some companies have started doing are doing item twins that in an accessible manner assess a particular standard, so that the standards can be assessed, so there are some things there just are no accommodations for. So for example, if you describe a picture, you may be giving the answer away. And so you need to have comparable items that are comparable in terms of the skills they assess in the context of whatever disability is being accommodated for. So,
exactly. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, so I guess I really have two questions. One is, do you have the opportunity to do that? And the other is, if you could, unless you already said it, and just I'll catch up, quickly remind me why we're doing all this fast item development.
So I'm going to address the first one. I do believe that paper cousins are something that Pearson is very skilled at doing, or not even paper. We tend to call them cousin items. And that is very definitely something that we would be able to provide if KDE were interested in that. Kevin, I saw you come off. It looked like your camera came on. Were you wanting to jump in, or did your camera just come up?
Oh, I was just going to follow up, Sharon, once, asking for the explanation on the timelines.
Yes, please go ahead. I'll let.
Yeah. So obviously we're always wanting to be able to increase item banks in order to have an array, if you will, of different item types across the board for assessment administration. But excuse me, we were also awarded a grant that allowed us to utilize some of those funds for an increase in item development. And in doing so, the timelines that we had to get it done were shortened or lesser than what we had anticipated. And so it was Phoebe, one of those deals where we knew we needed to get it done, and that was really the only way that we had available to spend those dollars and still be able to utilize it and for these resources.
Thank you.
Thank
Kevin.
you. I've been there.
Suzanne, I see your hand.
Thank you. This is Suzanne. I agree with what's been said about it'd be nice to have these by the number of items and then to project forward for how many years you have a bank and what you will need. And I was wondering if it would be possible perhaps to go a little deeper into the blueprint. So what are the number of items that are required and that you have, for example, the 3 cognitive areas, I'm going to call them, the domains crossed by the passage, informational, or I'm looking on my screen now, literary. So that, because this is at a higher level, but I'm sure you have more at a lower level, more detailed level to look at the item bank. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. And I'm sorry, Sharon, I'm not trying to jump in here. And Suzanne, I just want to make sure, just to get clarification. So, and Brian, this may be helpful as we move forward in our processes. Is that a recommendation? Are you making a formal recommendation on that too?
I guess so. I guess it's up to the rest of the TAC. It could be a suggestion, if not a formal recommendation.
And I think
see how Brian does this.
Yeah, absolutely. And maybe, Brian, that's what if they want to make a formal recommendation, and then once we get the group together, I don't think we're going to have to do this today, Brian. But moving forward, it might make it easier if the TAC members want to make a formal recommendation. We're definitely open to that, and it might help us to capture. And then at the end of future meetings, we can then go for those formal recommendations and let the group vote. So again, I'm sorry to throw that out there now. I just wanted to get clarification, Suzanne.
Yeah, I mean,
Suzanne.
Go ahead,
Suzanne and Suzanne and other members of the KTAC. As you might imagine, because this is a public meeting, there are restrictions on the types of information. And although, Suzanne, I know in your experience and probably most of ours, when it's a closed TAC meeting, a confidential TAC meeting, then confidential information such as detailed blueprints can be shared more readily. And I think part of what Kevin's hinting at is if there's a formal recommendation, then the department will work with KTAC to figure out how to present that information in a way that is compliant with the Open Meetings Act.
Is there any other discussion that anyone would like to have on reading? Because we are about to transition over to writing. Thank you. So we're going to start with on-demand writing. And just will give you a very, very high level summary of what this is in case the term is not familiar to you. The students are given passages to read. These passages are asking them to express an opinion, come up with an argumentative essay, and then they're analyzing the information. We'll look at a slide in just a moment that kind of walks through how much they're having to interact with as they go. There is trait scoring for this. So you can see at grade 5, the 40 points, grades 8 and 11, 48 points. The traits that the students are scored on are clarity and coherence, support, sourcing, organization, and then language and conventions. So again, this is carrying over from past development. I mentioned the passages to you. All of the passages are informational. They are all authentic sources. There is some art or a graph. I shouldn't say art to suggest the idea of a picture, but there is also some type of graphic that accompanies each passage set that a student encounters. So at grade 5, the student is going to have 2 passages, grade 8, 3, and at grade 11, 4. And I mentioned to you the types of prompts that the students are writing. Grade 5 is opinion, 8 and 11. They're writing argumentative essays. The development that we are doing a total of 6 passage sets per grade. And that's going to yield 12 prompts. And in terms of the blueprint comparison, this one's fairly straightforward because there is only the one requirement. You know, does it match? Is it an opinion? Is it an argumentative? And so 100% match here. And that was a very, very quick overview of on-demand writing. So unless there are questions, I'll move on now to editing and mechanics. Yes, Pete.
This is Pete. Is there I can't remember now. Is there more discussion on the scoring of this on-demand writing, or is that going to be talked about at the next TAC meeting?
I do not have scoring on my radar, Pete. I don't know, KDE, do you have any feedback there? Is this something that is on the agenda for the next TAC?
Pete, I think we're focusing on the item development this time, and we'll pick scoring up at the next meeting.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. For editing and mechanics, these are multiple choice, multiple select, and short answer items. Again, I'm going to point you to looking at the domain abbreviations. The students are being assessed on the conventions of standard English, knowledge of language and vocabulary acquisition and use. And these are, again, unchanged from previous development. The difference between editing and mechanics and on-demand writing and editing and mechanics and reading is that these passages are commissioned passages. And the reason for that is because the nature of the assessment. The student is being asked to identify errors or to identify why something, what the error is, and therefore those passages have to be commissioned so that those errors can be introduced. In terms of a set, there are 17 items per set developed, 12 multiple choice, 2 multiple select, and 3 short answer. And you can see the breakdown by domain. 12 of those items will be CSE, 2 of those items will be what I say K of L, and then 3 items, vocabulary acquisition and use. So in terms of the summary, we are doing 4 passages at grades 5 and 11, and then 5 passage sets at grade 8. And in terms of the blueprint comparison, the blueprint puts the conventions of standard English as one category, and then it combines knowledge of language and vocabulary acquisition and use into 20%. And so you can see there, the bank appears to be kind of a, not aligned the way you would want it to be. But what I want to point out is that there is a need to develop more of, to develop at least 2 items per the knowledge of language and the vocabulary acquisition and use, so that if an item doesn't survive, there's still going to be something that can be tested. So the mismatch that you see here, I don't think is the same. It doesn't send the same alarm signals that it might on the surface appear to. And Phoebe, you look like you want to ask a question.
I have no poker face. No, I just wanted to make sure I understood. So the bank includes items that have or have not been field tested, haven't necessarily survived. It's just it's like a raw bank as opposed to an operational ready bank.
So bank is going to include, at this point, everything for, I believe, reading, writing, and science was previously field tested. So there were standalone field tests. So what you're seeing here, that's going to be what currently exists that's eligible, either ready for operational or has been previously operational, plus the new development that would be field tested in the future.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. And we're going to leave our reading and writing and go into science unless there's something that you'd like me to go back to. Okay. So looking at science, the development is for grades 4, 7, and 11, and those are grade band assessments. So grade 4 is going to be assessing grades 1 through 4. Grade 7 assesses grades 5 through 7, and grade 11 assesses grades 8 and then high school. You have multiple choice, multiple select, TE, and short answer, and then the reporting categories of physical science, life science, earth and space science, and the engineering design. As we move on, you're going to see that science is going to have more differences with the current development compared to the past development. So some of the item types that might currently be on forms are not going to be part of the current development. Let's look at the similarities. The same grades are being assessed, the same blueprint, the same standards, the same framework as the basis, the multidimensional approach, the 3D approach that is common in science now. There are still cluster sets that are planned, although you're going to see that those cluster sets differ. There are still in the current bank, the prior development, multiple choice always existed, multiple select always existed, TE items always existed, short answer items always existed. And then with DOK, 1, 2, and 3, but one of the differences is that there's going to be a greater emphasis on DOK2, and that's as a result of the HUMRO alignment study. The differences that we need to look at. The current bank, the current forms, the current operational bank is 100% set-based. The development that is underway right now is a combination of standalone items and cluster sets but those sets, there are two different types of sets that are being developed. And those sets have some differences. One of the types of sets that we'll be looking at is called a discrete item set. And in that item set, the items are going to have a common stimulus, but those items can be swapped in and out on a form. They're not dependent in the sense of you've got to do number one before you can do number two, before you can do number three. There's no, you could almost think of these as we could pull them apart and put that stimulus and make it a standalone if we desired. There is also still the dependent set that is currently the type of set being developed or that's currently operational, but it's a set that's much reduced in terms of the reading load that students encounter, the number of items that the students will be expected to encounter. So we have reduced the number of items. I'm going to go ahead and stop and let Suzanne ask her question.
Hi, this is Suzanne. So the dependent set has a stimulus and then a series of items, but they're dependent on each other. So I'm wondering, are they scored polynomously, if I interpreted what you said correctly?
Right. I don't want to give the idea that they're dependent on one another entirely. Like, it's not that one must be correct before you can get number two, but the dependent set might allow greater exploration of the performance event. Steve, I think you would probably do a much better job explaining this if you can come on and just step in for a moment.
Sure. So think of the dependent set as kind of like your typical cluster where you're basically going to dive deeper into the PE. So instead of going like a mile wide and an inch deep, you're trying to go a mile deep, as it were, with like kind of an inch wide, if you want to go that way. The idea is that they are independent, so they're not polynomous. And in fact, the contrast is with the discrete set, where it's meant to be a bit broader and not as deep in the content. So they're both independent, such that the items are not dependent on another item. But it's kind of like a way of creating a framework for how you address the content, because the PEs are very rich and we want to try to give multiple access points to kids, but also give them, this opportunity to dive deeper if the content demands. That's the philosophy behind those two types of item sets.
Thank you, Steve.
Sure.
Another difference that we want to acknowledge or just bring up is that we are not developing 4-point extended response items for this development. They're all 2-point short answer items. And we're also developing an increased number of TE items. In terms of standalone, you can see that all of the different item types are being developed, and it's the development is going to be it's the same across each grade band. For the discrete item sets, so these are the ones where we said it might be possible for the items to, they're not going as deep. We have 8 items total being developed, and the breakdown is 2 or 3 multiple choice, 1 or 2 multiple select, 2 or 3 TE items, and 1 or 2 short answer items. For the dependent sets, 5 items per set are being developed, 1 multiple choice, 2 TE, and then 1 multiple select or 1 short answer. Just want to pause and see if there are any questions before I move on.
Oh, well,
yes.
It got physical there. This is Phoebe. Yeah, and maybe this isn't the time to discuss it. But the idea of having the item format specified independent of the construct is just an interesting one, and it may not be independent of the construct because there are probably deeper specs in there, but that might be something nice to talk about when we meet in person, because I'm not sure if that's part of the purpose of today, but if it is, I'd be glad to hear about it.
I think that this is something that there's always potentially some flexibility, but this kind of structure is useful when you're dealing with item writers and helping them to be able to know, what are you going to be providing as your assignment. So when we are ordering items, we always try to give that kind of structure to be able to also ensure that we're able to later have what we're going to need for our form. Suzanne?
Thank you. This is Suzanne. Just to piggyback on what Phoebe said, I was just wondering, what your criteria is for using the different formats, or what guidelines you have for the use of different formats, such as multiple select, and and to what extent is that information provided to item writers?
Can you elaborate a little when you're talking about the criteria for using? Do you mean what determines when that item type is used?
Yes, what actually it determines, because, there's so many more item types, and they're great different formats to assess skills and cognitive processes that multiple choice items alone cannot assess. But trying to think about, when would you move from a traditional multiple choice item to another item format? And I don't want to speak to Phoebe, but I'm wondering if this is what was behind her comment too.
Yeah, this is Phoebe. That is part of it. It's almost like what kind of construct, what kind of knowledge and skill are you trying to get at that would require, for example, technology enhanced type of item versus a multiple select item.
So,
for example.
Right. Steve, I saw you come off camera. Do you want to go ahead and address that?
Sure. Yeah. So we have a couple of tools at our disposal in order to assess the different skills that students can demonstrate. So, for example, many of the PEs will deal with modeling, right, in science. So we have an element that our writers can create that allows the students to build a diagram. So they could add labels, they would indicate relationships with arrows, they could arrange the elements within that diagram to reflect a concept, right? So now in multiple choice, we could try something like, 4 options, right, that have pre-made models. But as a tool to help, the students sort of create their own knowledge or demonstrate their own knowledge, that type of TE can be handy. Question.
Yeah, I just wanted to make it clear that I wasn't questioning the use of different item types. It's just more the criteria for determining when you use, like with that item modeling, that makes a whole lot of sense. If you're doing a modeling item, you'd want it to be of a specific format. But but just, yeah, how it's decided, that's all, rather than having,
I see.
and maybe,
versus
and I'm
the-
sure it's there in your specs, it's just not
Well,
seeing the crosses independent
Yeah.
of that is difficult.
Sure. So one of the criteria is really to let the content drive it, in the sense that we want the students to deal with real world phenomena, right? We want them to engage in the process of sense making. And so the context that the writers come up with, in reference to the alignment, and the three-dimensional alignment, the SEPs, the content, and then the cross-cutting concepts. That kind of drives whether it's a dependent set or a discrete set, as well as the approach within those TEs. So for using that one with the build a model as an example, right? But there are other SEPs that deal with, solutions. That's kind of vague, so we also want to have different modalities, right? So we have multiple ways of students demonstrating their understanding. So we have some text heavy things, some phenomena kind of lend themselves to that. Some phenomena will be much more data driven and mathematical relationships. And then others will be more visual spatial. So the content, we don't want to try to shove that, that square peg in a round hole when it comes to the content. So we want it to flow. We want it to be this sort of, natural phenomena, if you will, that the students can engage with and have a variety of access points. Does that help?
A little, but I do understand that you can't put item specs on a public meeting. So, but yeah, I appreciate that.
And Phoebe, I would also add, I think just to elaborate, I was in the same position that Steve and Jane were in a few years ago when I worked on Kentucky a few years ago. So I was in there heavily doing development. It was social studies, it was not science. But my philosophy and the philosophy that many of us shared in social studies was that usually you can assess every standard using every different item type, because there are different aspects to a standard that can be assessed with a different item type. And I think that the Kentucky academic standards are such that it is possible that this kind of approach, that it's not necessary to go in and to prescribe up front and to say this standard will only be a multiple choice item. That there is some ability to read into the standard and to say this is going to work for a multiple choice in this situation, and this is going to work for a TE in another. But that may also be just my personal experience and opinion. Any other questions that we'd like to address before we keep going? Thank you for asking questions. Elena, and I hope I pronounced that correctly. Please correct me if not. You're on mute.
Apologies. This is Elena. Thank you so much. I just wanted to, and I understand that, I think what is difficult, going back to a comment that Phoebe said, this is a public meeting, so it's kind of hard to dive a little bit deeper into some of the blueprint specifications, but some of these areas are really massive. So one of the things that I'm just trying to get my head around is how this kind of connects to some of the, for example, the three-dimensional aspects. For example, like to what extent are we really having coverage around, say, disciplinary core ideas, cross-cutting concepts, science and engineering practices? All of that just seems really nebulous. because it's hard to understand how this connects back to that based on the information shared. And again, I understand this is not probably the time and place, but it's really hard, I think, for us to understand how these things are being covered or addressed, or in some ways, if it's not, then I think it'd be helpful also for the field to understand like what aspects need to be addressed so that it's not just that they're focused on, for example, things that they see on the assessments, but it's really important for them to think about the other areas that need to be attended to, because it's not possible, or even just possible by any state, to be honest, to really cover all of that under one assessment. So just, I'd love to just hear your thoughts, because it's really hard for me to understand exactly what is being covered here.
Right. I'm going to let Steve address that. I saw him come off camera. Come on camera.
Right. So all of the items will be aligned to the DCI within that respective PE. And then we talk about, okay, well, can we have a dual, it has to be dually aligned. So it's got to have another dimension, SEP or the CCC. And then with sort of like if you think of the dependent set, right, going deeper, that's where we really want to hit those 3D aligned items. So often that is going to be with a little bit more of an engaging item. We don't want it too engaging. We've got 2 points to work with, but what can we do, right? So I'm referring to the short answer, the essay. But with some of the other items, we can still, and depending on the content again, we can get into the 3D alignment. So we don't have a specific requirement like every PE has to have the 3D alignment, but it has to have at least 2D alignment. And part of that decision is the content and letting the phenomena drive the boat.
Thank you, Steve. Any other questions before I move on? So we've been talking about the different domains, and you can see here what the requirements are and where the bank is. The engineering is the area that's dual aligned, and so it's very hard to say up front that this is what the bank is going to end up looking like after the development, because that is going to be determined as the development occurs and as that opportunity for dual alignment comes in. And so I am going to move to the very last slide, which is about questions. And I know we've been having questions as we go, but perhaps you have some other questions, suggestions, anything that you'd like me to go back to. So let me turn it back over to you to discuss as we need to.
Sharon, go ahead, Pete.
Hi, thanks. This is Pete. Not to belabor a question I had earlier, but I think I want to rephrase my question that had to do with the on-demand writing. So this is going back a way. You don't have to go to the slides or anything. And I was asking about scoring, and I guess what I'm interested in is that on-demand writing tasks have a lot of facets that you're scoring on. I think there was 6 or 7 different facets. And so it's not that I'm interested in what the scoring is. I'm interested in the scoreability of the items that you're developing to ensure that you can adequately score all of those facets that you're claiming that you're going to be able to score. And so I guess it's not just after the fact seeing how these things are scored, but I guess moving into maybe the next meeting or whatever, it would be good to see the evaluation of the scoreability of your initial items that you're developing, so that you can see that you're on the right track and you know the elements that need to be included in those on-demand writing tasks so that you can ensure that they're scoreable, are accurately and adequately scoreable on all of those different facets that you intend to score them on. So maybe that made more sense.
I understand. Yeah, thank you, Pete. I'll address that really quickly, and then I'll let Charlotte or Jane, if either of them has anything to add. So every essay that is, or every item that's going to require an extended response or a short answer, those are going through our scoring experts at Pearson. So the team that is on this call, these are our content people who are developing the items. And then they're going to be sending those items over to our scoring experts who are going to be reviewing them, giving them feedback. These are people with not only long experience with Pearson, but also a long experience in many cases working on the Kentucky summative assessments. So Jane, I saw you come off camera. Would you like to add anything?
You said it perfectly.
Thank you. And I keep saying come off camera, and I think I really should be saying come on camera, but I got my prepositions all mixed up. What other, Pete, you were saying something, and then we turned it over to, I'm sorry, Brian, you were saying something and we turned it over to Pete.
Yeah, thanks. This was just an expansion, I think, to the type of information in the tables that you provided. That'd be helpful. One was if you can include sort of a timeline, so because the items are being developed but aren't yet field tested. So I don't know if they, given Kentucky's matrix design, maybe they can all be field tested in 1 year, but if the idea is to give if the purpose of the tables is to give, is to tell how many items are usable in the bank, I think that the number surely should differentiate between items that haven't been field tested versus those that have. And then if the field testing is going to take more than 1 year, then it would be good to indicate that. And then we're talking about field testing. How many of the constructed items for Kentucky are going to be automated scoring items?
I do not have that percentage available to me. I'm sorry. We could work on gathering that information, but I know that Kentucky has heavily used what at Pearson we call it our IEA, our Intelligent Essay Assessor.
Yeah. So I was assuming the extended responses, the shorter responses, I'm not sure. One of the items you'll see coming up next is a pre-equated item, and I think pre-equated is of interest because they're trying to speed things up, which means the scoring needs to be speeded up. And so part of it will be to make sure that the automated scoring can also be trained before the items are administered in a full administration. So if that's just part of field testing, if there's also sort of field testing of the scoring or development of the scoring. And then I think just to refine the asterisk even more, if there's some idea about what survival rates, you probably know what your typical survival rates are, but so many of the items for Kentucky are done in sets that the survival rate's probably a little bit lower. So if you could maybe include that in sort of a forecasting of what the bank might be as you go through the different stages.
Thank you. I can address the IEA just with a thumbnails versus piece of information. I do know that they are able to start doing some training in advance, and so there are different methods that are available for them to do the training, and that they are definitely able to do a lot of quick turnaround. So, what else would you like to discuss?
Well, Sharon, great job. You got us back on schedule.
Oh, wonderful. Well, thank you so much for your time today and for the collaboration.
Thank
I
you.
hope you'll have a great afternoon. And I
Thank you
am
very
not
much.
going to stop sharing. I remembered that.
That's right.
KDE.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I think our next agenda item, Bill, are you going to be introducing that? You may want to take control then.
Yes. Introduction. This is Bill Audie. I serve the Kentucky Department of Education as a psychometrician on a consulting basis, and I'm the half. This is the half topic that Brian mentioned at the outset, because we're setting up the more in-depth conversation at the June meeting, and as has already happened, the discussion of new items often brings up questions about the scaling, and we want to share our thinking about how we maintain the scale and why we're maintaining the scale, and just make sure that we're not missing anything to that point. So the issue is the scale. And as we discussed, I think the last time in the previous meetings, we are moving to pre-equated item calibration. And as generally you as a TAC were supportive of going with that route. So in terms of timeline, we are doing some studies, and I don't know if we'll have results, but we can at least tell you the preliminary findings of that in June. And if all goes well, we'd move to pre-equating for the spring of 2025. And as you just heard, there are some item types being introduced and changes to form design in some content areas. This again can happen no quicker than, this will be field tested in 2025, so 2026. So there's 2 changes in 2 years. One bit of context, it was there, but I want to highlight it in this discussion, is that the item development is being done to sort of fill the bank. It wasn't prompted by changes to the blueprint or some other major instructional change planned. So therefore, KDE intends to maintain the scales across all the grades and subjects. Our rationale for doing that was that the change to the content standards is minor. And the panels, I don't know if we went into detail with this group. There's a fairly elaborate process in Kentucky for revising the content standards. I believe it's something like 12 public panels review all the standards. And so there's a lengthy record, and I looked at science particularly because that's where there's perhaps the most sort of change in format. And the panelists explicitly said this: we do not intend or signal any change in instructional intent, and it's because there are new science standards being adopted, have been adopted, I believe, and so that the content standard, the scale, underlying measurement scale, can be maintained. We're going to, as a part of that switch to pre-equating, do the studies to evaluate the stability of the scale in 2024, comparing it with 2023. And so we will have some statistical evidence that maintaining the scale is reasonable, and we'll share that with you. The last point here is that there have been a lot of changes in the state assessment in education generally, as it had nationwide, primarily the big one being the disruption during and after COVID. And the department has an interest in maintaining the target in the information provided to schools so that that can remain stable as possible while we're evaluating what has changed and where we went. So the assumption underneath that is that maintaining the scale is not a pure statistical question, but a somewhat balanced by the intentions of the department, by the overall system. And to that end, Katie would intends to maintain the scale. So that's the overview of what we wanted to discuss. And to prepare ourselves and you for the discussion, these are the questions we've got. Are there additional studies, information you want, so forth? Corinne.
Sorry if I missed it, but would you mind kind of describing at least briefly what statistical analyses you already plan to do to check the maintenance of the scale, or what's kind of the framework there?
Yeah, I'm going to start, and I don't know if LaCoon is still on, but she can correct anything I've messed up. But at the high level, what we're going to do is essentially pre-equate and post-equate simultaneously. In other words, we will take all the items that we're using in 2024 have prior or almost all have prior calibrations. And so we can do the pre-equating, and then we will go through our typical process of post-equating, and we can compare them. LaCoon, do you want to add anything to that as a general description?
Yes, so in general, Bill, you're right. Basically, this year we have pretty much almost all items have the banked parameters in place. We're still going to use the post-equating method for this year's scoring table because we have predetermined anchor item set. But with the item parameters in place, that will enable us to run a pre-equating study to compare the IRT post-equated parameters with their banked parameters, see if they are stable enough.
Okay, thank you. I do recall that from last time. It was even in the minutes. But I'm thinking I'll raise my hand again to number 1 potentially.
Okay. Phoebe?
Yeah, that's good. But I guess, and I should go back to the minutes to find out if we discussed it last time, but that will take more time than just asking you. So do you have any criteria for determining how you're going to decide whether the test is ready to be recalibrated rather than post?
It's the same tag team, but generally we have discussed criteria and the data we'll look at in terms of a cut point in which we say, yes, it's good, no, it's bad. We haven't done it to that level. LaCoon, do you want to say more to that?
Yeah, I just want to add on to that. So both item level analysis and test level analysis are planned in the pre-equating study. So for the item level study, we're going to use a robustly criteria. So the same criteria we use for the post-equating, but for the pre-equating study, we basically enlarge the whole anchor set to be any item which has the banked parameters and compare their robustly value using the same threshold that we use for the post-equating. And for the test level analysis, we're going to compare the TCC using their post-equated parameters calculation versus the pre-equated calculation, see if 2 sets of TCC are aligned to each other.
And I think we would say that we are going to be looking for, or particularly wary of directional shift. In other words, if there's some random items that are a little bit off, but they're balanced, that's less of a concern than if there's some trend in the newer, in one method or the other. So that also gets to what you might call differential test
Right. So
Performance.
that's what.
performance.
So I just want to thank you, and then also follow up that, I'd be interested in seeing a little more detail on what eventually, at the next meeting, what would make not a hard and fast rule, but what would sound off the alarms? How would you determine what the correct solution is? Whether is post-equating the gold standard, or is those kind of things. That's all, rather than kind of doing it post hoc.
Yes, and that it actually, I'm now recalling it was from the last meeting. It may have been you, because you used the gold standard, that we don't accept post-equating as the gold standard. So that's why we can't say it has to be this much like the past. But yes, I take the point taken in terms of more
Nor
detail.
do I.
More detail on what our rules will be for acceptance. Suzanne, you've got the number one.
Thank you. This is Suzanne. So I'm with the new item types. I'm assuming that they've been included and based on the conversation thus far, because they might be assessing something a little differently, or assessing some skills or processes that haven't been assessed in the past. So I'm wondering how you plan on including them now and the future.
Yes, as I've been listening, we've sort of got two threads. One is the item development thread that you went on, and so I'm thinking that that's something I would take, as we will get that information to you, and it may come from the item development side rather than, because they're the ones working with the blueprints and item creation. Is that reasonable? Is that a reasonable summary of what you're asking for? Okay, I got a nod. Corinne?
Yeah, thank you. This is more of a process question. Do you have access directly to the minutes from the last one? Because as I look here, I couldn't agree more with some of the things that were recommended by our TAC about representative sampling for the equating methods and different things of that nature. There's several things. But I know we've talked today about what's a formal recommendation, what isn't. So probably this is a little bit more for Brian, I'm not sure. But I would just encourage you to make sure that, somehow you're kind of keeping notes so that in June we can kind of see some of those things reflected.
Okay. Yes, we did look at this in terms of our work in putting the plan together, and we'll look at it again as we're going forward. Brian, it looks like there's a suggestion for the equating as a topic. We won't again have our final results. Look, LaCoon, are you comfortable that we could have some useful information from our stability study in June?
We might not be able to get the study done in June because of the operational schedule. So what we plan to do is to use the same full spring 2024 sample for both post-equating and pre-equating study. After we have the post-equating results ready, we'll move on with the pre-equating study. And for these two components will be finished in July.
So I probably overstated that a bit. Hopefully we can share information, but the schedule is not favorable for that.
So I think that maybe the request of the TAC is not to accelerate the schedule and get results, but certainly the information about the study design, including the data, the criteria, the decision rules, could be shared in June.
We could, and there would also be time to bring the study results to the TAC in the fall. And then if there is an issue, it doesn't look like we can go forward, we're not committed to it. We can do post-equating without problem. So you will get a look at the study results themselves before we have to make that final decision.
And Bill and other people for KDE, if you don't have to say it now, but if you could indicate in the next KTAC meeting for pre-equating which grades and subject areas you're thinking of. So for example, if it works for pre-equating works for reading, would you go ahead with that in reading, but not in the other areas? Or so if you could just give some indication about what the what decisions will be made on the basis of the studies being done. Corinne?
I'll back up to my question I raised my hand for, but I didn't quite understand what you were asking of us, Brian, just now.
Oh, I was just suggesting to KDE that in addition to the study, that they just be very specific about the decisions they're going to make and the timeline. And I was suggesting that moving to pre-equating doesn't have to be an all or nothing thing by all content areas. Science is having many more changes than the other ones, and it may be more difficult, for example, for one content area than the others.
No, I apologize. I thought you were asking us to reflect on that for this meeting. Yeah. Yeah, I guess the only thing I can think of from the slides here is that since there are those minor content changes, probably in anything like item parameter drifters, it might be nice to maybe cluster the items that have, been affected by or might be affected by standard changes, and to look and see if they're particularly sensitive or problematic in the pre-equating. But it sounds like they're going to be minor changes, so hopefully that wouldn't be the thing.
Yes, and to be clear, we have not, even in science, done any the psychometric model does not include clustering of items. So the items, we have litmus items, but those items are treated as independent and put on the single Roche scale. But then our evaluation for equating studies and for item drift have not been targeted for the changes, and I'll take that as the recommendation that keep an eye on these items as we're starting to.
Yes, that's exactly what I meant. I was using clustering in a much looser term of look at them maybe as a group at some point to see if they stand out in any way compared to the others. Yeah.
Yes, there's a cluster of meanings around the word cluster. And with that, I think we're done. I'm done anyway.
Okay, any other comments before we move on? Thank you, Bill and colleagues. Let's see. So, summary, let me try to summarize. Ben, can I was thinking, is there a way that I can share my screen?
Yes. All you have to do is in the upper right hand. Yeah.
I'm going to share a window. Is that what it is?
Brian, it should be, if you have a collection of windows, you should be able to click on that and it should bring up the screen you're wanting to display.
It is it's thing I have to. Oh, I have to allow sharing.
That's it's likely your computer is wanting permission to share to Teams as an app, because I've got you set up with full presenter
Yeah.
privileges
Okay.
right now.
Yeah. It says I have to restart if I'm going to do that. So can we take a 3-minute break? And Kevin, I'll send you this and let you share it. Is that okay?
Yeah, you can send it to me. You can send it to me. Yep.
Okay, folks. Why don't we take a 5-minute break and we'll get set up to do this. Thank you. At some point, the TAC members will need to make a formal recommendation and vote on any official recommendations that you have for the department coming from the meeting. We don't have to do that today, but in preparation for that, this is a summary of the recommendations that I culled. And so what I'd like you to do is to read them. You can read them here. I sent them to you just a minute ago as well. If it's easier for you to read them on your own screen, you can do that. And so we're looking for any changes in wording, any additions that I may have missed. And the listing came from individuals. So I think we're looking for, if you don't agree with something, so I think the recommendations, what we'd like to have is a majority of the KTAC members, if not unanimous. Otherwise, it may stand as a minority a recommendation or suggestion or an individual one. So, so one thing, if you could read them and say, whether you would think about whether you would be willing to support it. So we don't need to do the vote today, but we will need to do it eventually. Pete, go ahead, please.
This is Pete. This is a recommendation that I didn't make while we were on the topic, but I figured we'd have some time at some point. And that is for the discussion of the alternative assessment. I think the group that was there was quite knowledgeable about the content and aspects of administration, but they could have used some support from whoever's doing the psychometric side of the house, so that when we have questions regarding that we could get those answered. So my recommendation would be to have additional support for the conversations during TAC meetings.
Okay, you won't see the additions on the screen because I don't have control of the screen, but I'll.
I can add that, Brian.
Okay, so Kevin, I think we're adding maybe right after the first bullet. Okay. Is in future KTAC meetings, those responsible for strict support of the alternative assessment of the alternate assessment should be available.
You say psychometric support?
Yeah, psychometric support for the alternate assessment should be available in future KTAC meetings.
And Pete, this is Bill Odie. Pete, do you want to? Are you looking for something in particular, or a general overview of how the scoring, scaling, equating, the traditional functions work for that assessment?
So I think part of it is, yes, a general overview, and part of it is just being able to answer questions that come up.
So you'll notice at the last bullet at the very bottom, it says provide explanation and evidence supporting the scoring method and quality, both for the attainment task assessment and the college career readiness assessment. So I think we're asking for for more complete discussion of scoring, which we didn't get into today. But Pete, I think your suggestion was just in the TAC meeting, have people who are able to respond to comments and questions as they may come up. Okay, Elena.
This is Elena. I just wanted to add something to the third bullet, which is the analyze inclusion and participation. I think it's really important for just every state to really look at significant disproportionality issues. And this is an area that's been problematic in many settings, and this wasn't discussed. So I think it's important just to be explicit about this.
So Kevin, maybe as under homebound irregular attendance, so these are specific ones. Another bullet would be proportional representation by significant student groups. Lena, did that capture the recommendation?
Did you say yes, Elena? Is it okay? Okay. I'm sorry.
Sorry about that. Yes.
No, you're fine. You're fine.
This is Phoebe. I'm not sure what the first bullet means. So maybe
first bullet, Phoebe, maybe we can tune it so it's more. So that was a reference to the data that were being shared by the alternate assessment folks was from 2021.
Right. Yeah.
And you know, we didn't go into what the barrier for data sharing agreements was, but I think the recommendation was it would be best to maintain current data. And then the second part of it was clear that they had their own database, but it wasn't integrated with to answer questions about impact, like the assessment results and things like that. So that's what you can think of a way to clarify that, that would be helpful. That's what that first bullet was.
Thank you. And I'd like to, I also looked at the technical manual and it was from 21-22.
Okay.
And so to keep updated versions of the technical manual available.
Okay. So Kevin, let's make that another bullet, which is
here is a second.
Yeah, sure. Publish current editions of the technical manual. Current usually means and after every year there will be something that reflects the results from the past year.
Just a quick note, I believe they were showing 21, 22.
22, yes.
And the 23, they said because of some data issues and also I believe a staffing issue that the 2023 is not yet official and posted. So it's not, so we will we'll definitely do that. It wasn't an oversight at this moment. It just isn't available at this moment.
Thanks, Bill.
That's what I was going to say is it's in development. It's just not in its final draft, Phoebe, which, you know, it has to go through several steps before it can be released out publicly, but that's correct. It is being developed.
Thanks, Kevin. Suzanne?
This is Suzanne. Brian, I mentioned this, and I'm not sure if the rest of the TAC members would agree with me, but I thought the theory of action was very good and was presented initially. And if possible, not this time perhaps, but thinking in the future, maybe 24, 25, to bring the validity argument right in the beginning and then just reference it and have a summary at the end.
Okay, yeah, thank you. I missed that. So Kevin, maybe under the current editions of the technical manual, the second bullet, we could just, if you put a sub-bullet under that one. So that should be integrate the validity argument validation throughout the technical manual. Integrate the validity evaluation argument with the theory of action throughout the technical manual chapters. Comma, including a summary at the end. Suzanne, is that okay?
Yeah, the theory action is so nice that, bringing up the validity argument and what claims and assumptions are, I think that's useful, and then just referencing it as you go from chapter to chapter.
Any other comments on this set of recommendations for alternate assessment or draft recommendations currently? Kevin, why don't we scroll down to the next block, which is the item development. Again, KTAC members, any suggestions for improving these?
And this might not be something that can be done because of the public meeting law. Is it possible to have a confidential portion of the meeting where the TAC could look at more detailed information? Because I don't want to push anything on here that would reveal secure information.
Yeah, Phoebe, let's, Kevin, we're aware that KDE will have to figure out how to comply with all. On this first bullet, if you could put a sub bullet after that one where it's the various item types, and then if you just say, if possible, could KDE arrange for the TAC to review confidential materials and have associated conversations? And then Phoebe, I think we're making clear to KDE that if they could figure out how to do it, then we could go forward.
Thank you.
Any other comments about the item development? Okay, Kevin, let's go to the last one, to preparation to move to pre-equating.
I think Corinne has a question.
Yes, please.
Yeah, I noticed the last one has that C, the 124. Are we kind of leaving that as a blanket? There's other things in there too, because there was more than representative sampling. Or did we want to try to pull out from those so that all the recommendations are here?
Let's change that one. So Kevin, if you could change that bottom bullet to attend to 124 KTAC recommendations, including representative sampling. Does that work, Corinne?
Yeah, I just saw there was good stuff in there. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
Is that correct? Is that Brian? Corinne, is that what you wanted to? Okay.
Okay. Kevin, sounds like this is the set of comments we have on the draft recommendations, and you have them. So
I will. I'll save these, Brian, and send them right back to you, and you can share them with the members. I'll do that right now. I'm gonna quit sharing so that you don't see all my errors and mistakes at once. But I'll clean that up and get it sent right back to you, and I'll let you take control again of the screen if you'd like, or I can ask Ben if he wants to.
I don't think we need the any of the PowerPoint.
Okay.
So just in terms of next steps, KTAC members, I'll supplement the recommendations with the required information that KDE requires, which is a short summary of the discussion, including who presented and who was present for the meeting today, and I'll get that to you in a couple of days. We need to, and then if you could take a day or two to get that, any suggestions back to me, the department needs to post that fairly quickly. And then we have a scheduled in-person meeting June 12 and 13 in Kentucky. We need to confirm the location, but the meeting will be in person. We're looking forward to seeing everyone together. And if you have any suggestions for topics for the TAC meeting, we have a little more time to go into depth than we've had in the last couple of meetings. So if you can get those to me soon, I'll work with the department and the contractors to prepare for that.
Brian, just to follow up on confirmation, we'll be meeting here at the Sauer building,
okay,
300 Sauer building. We'll be in our state boardroom. So for both days, we've got that reserved and held for both meetings.
So for the KTAC members, that means the meeting will be in Frankfort, Kentucky. If you check and make your plane reservations, you have several choices. Covington or Northern Kentucky has several things. It's about an hour and a half from Frankfort. Louisville also has several. That's about an hour from Frankfort. Lexington is closer, but it has fewer schedules. I think that we'll plan to start the first day at 8:30, and then we'll start both days at 8:30. The second day we will end by 2:30, so you can plan your flights out after that.
Brian, would you mind, in no rush, kind of sending or whoever, maybe it's you, Kevin, sending some info about all that? Like I'm kind of taking notes, but
I will.
Yeah, good airport things, what we should do in terms of hotel, all that. Yeah.
Yes, I'll send that to Corinne. Thanks.
And we might want to try to figure out once we know who's coming in where, riding together or something to get to.
Yeah,
go ahead, Kevin.
I was going to say there's local here in Frankfort. There's hotels. I mean, obviously nothing right next to our office building, but there are hotels close by. You're going to get more of a variety probably in Louisville, Lexington, but again, Frankfort probably being pretty central to those. But obviously traveling out of both, you're going to probably deal with traffic in the mornings to try to get here, especially during that early morning commute. So, we're happy. I know Brian will share some information, but we're happy to address anything with you as well.
Kevin is a super commuter, so he knows about the commute. So Corinne and others, I'll prepare a short thing about air travel and hotels, and some there will be you won't run out of eating places to eat in just 2 evenings. So there are interesting things to do.
And I think making sure, I'm already thinking, I don't know how early would be too early for a flight on that Thursday. Like, how easy is it to get a ride back out to one of the airports? How far away?
Okay,
So
I can
Kevin, if you
include
could
that.
just kind of think from our perspective, not knowing, giving us some tips, that would be great.
Right.
Yeah, yeah.
And you said we'll end at 2:30?
Yeah, 2:30.
Thank you.
And so, Corinne, just as a rule of thumb, if you're going out of Cincinnati, it's about an hour and a half. So if we're out at 2:30 and you leave by 3, then you're there at 4:30. That probably means a 5:30 flight is the earliest you can do. Louisville, you could probably do 5 o'clock. I'll send that in. I'll write that and send it to people. Do we have any other questions or comments? We're looking forward to getting together. Okay, if
Ryan?
not, then
Sorry,
Suzanne,
this is
please.
Suzanne, I was wondering, do we have any, I didn't look, but so forgive me, meetings after our in-person meeting planned?
We have October.
October.
Yeah. Let me look. I can look real quick and
It's
see
October 8th, and we're holding 11 to 5 Eastern, and it'll probably be shorter than that, but that's I think that's the thing that we ask people to reserve. October 8th. And on our next, maybe I can do a poll before our next TAC meeting to try to find some dates before, after the October one. Okay, if we don't have anything else, then if we could have a motion to adjourn from one of the KTAC members.
I'll move.
Pete, any second?
Second.
Suzanne. Okay, any discussion? All in favor, please say yes.
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 Okay, thank you, everyone. We'll
Thank you.
look forward to seeing you in a couple of months.